Under a pale light, the dust of centuries drifts through the air of forgotten libraries. Shelves groan beneath the weight of atlases, whose pages have not been turned in lifetimes. Their parchment smells of rain and smoke, of journeys that never quite ended. When one of those maps is opened, the world rearranges itself, borders shift, coastlines blur, and there, written in elegant ink across the vastness of Eurasia, is a name that modern tongues rarely speak. Asterisk asterisk, Tartaria. Asterisk asterisk. Once, it seems, this name stretched from the icy reaches of Siberia to the edge of Europe. Mountains were drawn smaller to make room for it. Rivers bent toward it. Travelers described grand cities and nations that no longer appear in our history books. Yet today, in classrooms and encyclopedias, Tartaria has no place. It is as if an entire empire was swallowed by silence, leaving behind only a whisper on yellowed paper. When you trace the contours of those maps, you feel a faint unease, a quiet question that lingers at the edge of reason. How could something so immense vanish so completely? The maps are not crude sketches of fantasy. They are detailed, measured, authoritative. They were made by cartographers who mapped the known world with precision. So where did their certainty go? And why does our version of history pretend that this vast civilization was nothing but a misprint? In the flicker of candlelight, one can imagine an explorer's hand hesitating over that name, unsure whether to trust his eyes or the official narrative. Across centuries, these hesitations multiplied until only fragments remained. A coat of arms here, an architectural style there, a reference in an old traveller's log. Each piece small, but together forming an outline of something once enormous. Something that does not fit the story we've been told. Modern textbooks are clean and silent. They present the world as neatly as a modern map, with borders fixed and truths certain. But these older maps feel alive. Their coastlines breathe. Their margins hum with forgotten secrets. They are not just geography, they are memory. They remind us that history is not a line, but a palimpsest, written and rewritten by those who hold the pen. Perhaps Tartaria was never meant to disappear entirely. Perhaps it was meant to be misremembered, reduced to a curiosity so small that few would ever question its absence. After all, what happens when a name is erased from education? It drifts into myth. It becomes folklore, then conspiracy, then nothing. Yet still, it lingers faintly, like an afterimage burned into the collective mind of humanity. The thought invites a subtle shiver. If something so vast can vanish from record, what else might have been quietly removed? What if entire epochs have slipped through the cracks between what we know and what we are allowed to know? Each erased line on a map could be a door one that opens not into fantasy, but into the forgotten rooms of our own history. In the stillness of these libraries, the silence feels almost deliberate. The maps are not merely relics, they are confessions. Each curve of ink seems to whisper, asterisk, we saw something, we recorded it, and then we were told to forget. Asterisk. You can almost hear the echo of that command in the turning of every brittle page. And yet, these old maps survive. They wait, patient and unbending, for the eyes willing to see beyond the story. They wait for those who sense that truth does not vanish. It only hides beneath layers of convenience and time. Somewhere between the folds of parchment and the blank spaces of modern geography lies a missing chapter, a civilization that refuses to die quietly. How does an empire so large that it spanned continents vanish so completely that history forgot its name? The question lingers like fog over a vanished sea. It invites not panic, but quiet wonder. Because if such a disappearance is possible, then perhaps history is not what we think it is. Perhaps the map we've inherited is not the territory of truth, but the design of memory itself, selective, incomplete, and endlessly rewritten. And if Tartaria was once real, if its name once thundered across the world, then something of it must remain. A trace, a ruin, a whisper, carved in stone. For no empire ever fades without leaving shadows. If Tartaria existed, where are its ruins? Beneath the cold skies of St. Petersburg, a city that gleams like a frozen dream, lie stones that seem too old to belong. The facades rise in impossible symmetry pillars as smooth as poured mercury, staircases carved with mathematical grace, domes that capture light as though designed to speak to the sun. Tourists photograph them without question. Locals hurry past, unaware that they walk among impossibilities. But when the evening mist softens the outlines of these monuments, a quiet unease begins to stir. Who built these giants of granite and marble, and why do so few records speak their names? The official story is simple. The Tsars commanded, and armies of artisans obeyed. Yet in the archives of the 1700s, something feels misaligned. Structures said to have risen within a decade would, by the standards of their own age, have taken generations. Blueprints appear, but the signatures beneath them are inconsistent. The same architect, designing in two different cities, on two different dates, separated by months of travel. The materials tell another story still. Blocks that weigh hundreds of tons fitted together so perfectly that even a blade of grass cannot slide between them. Chisel marks absent, tool signatures invisible. It is as if the stones were melted and set, rather than carved and lifted. Engineers today visit these sites with scanners and models, trying to reconcile method with result. Many shake their heads quietly. A few admit, when the cameras are off, that some of these surfaces show precision that modern machinery would struggle to duplicate without laser calibration. The arches of Street, Isaac's Cathedral, the subterranean galleries beneath the Winter Palace, the resonance chambers hidden within its domes, all echo the logic of something greater than decoration. Each line and curve seems tuned, as if to a frequency that modern eyes no longer hear. Further east, across the plains of Central Asia, the pattern repeats. In Samarkand, the ancient Registan square glitters with turquoise mosaics, but beneath it lie foundations built from fused stone, vitrified, glassy, almost as though exposed to heat beyond the reach of primitive kilns. In the deserts of Mongolia, solitary fortresses crumble in silence, their walls composed of stones magnetized along precise vectors. No man's claim compasses twist near them, as if something within the rock remembers a different alignment of the earth. The deeper you look, the more the timeline fractures. Historians date certain palaces to the 18th century, yet travelers' journals from 2 centuries earlier describe those same structures standing, already weathered by age. Paintings show facades that match perfectly what we see now, not as newly built marvels, but as ancient relics being rediscovered. Somewhere, history folded over itself, and we forgot which layer came first. These are not the grand ruins of Egypt or Rome, set apart and celebrated. They live among us: government buildings, railway stations, orphanages, cathedrals, their grandeur domesticated, their mystery disguised as heritage. The Tartarian style, as some call it, hides in plain sight. Massive columns, ornate arches, domes crowned with spires that once might have conducted something more than weather. A forgotten language of form, whispered in stone. When lightning strikes certain towers, energy hums through buried iron rods that predate recorded electrification. Old diagrams show networks of domes and minarets connected by metallic lines, almost like the circuitry of a forgotten machine. Was it ornament or design? The architects are silent, their names lost or borrowed. And yet, their fingerprints remain a geometry too precise to be coincidence. Imagine for a moment that we have misunderstood what ancient means. Perhaps not everything older is primitive. Perhaps the world has cycled through peaks of mastery, each leaving traces mistaken for miracles. When one culture collapses, the survivors inherit wonders they no longer comprehend. They use cathedrals as churches, towers as bell houses, columns as symbols of power, never knowing they were once instruments. In Street Petersburg, beneath the shining surface, tunnels stretch for miles. Some are flooded, others sealed with walls whose age defies documentation. Urban legends speak of lower levels carved before the city itself officially existed, carved in styles that mirror the architecture above, as though the entire city was built upon its own reflection. A city beneath a city, preserved in stone. Engineers analyzing the foundations note something curious. Beneath certain buildings, the ground is scorched, the soil vitrified, as though immense heat, not fire but energy, once surged upward, a memory of some forgotten technology or catastrophe. Yet the records remain mute, and the silence around them feels coordinated. Excavations are restricted, documentation buried in bureaucratic vaults. The stones, however, cannot be censored. They stand in quiet defiance, their very precision a question that will not fade. And what of Mongolia, where the wind moves over plains that once bore caravans along the Silk Road? There, remnants of immense structures lie scattered, megaliths aligned with stars, stones that vibrate faintly when struck, as if tuned to some ancient note. Shepherds tell of hearing low tones on still nights, a hum rising from the earth itself. Superstition, perhaps, or resonance, the aftersound of architecture that once spoke to the sky. Modern science calls these coincidences. Yet coincidence, repeated across continents, becomes pattern. And patterns tell stories even when language fails. A single style, a single method of impossible precision, spanning thousands of miles. How could that happen without connection? Unless, of course, there once was connection. A civilization whose knowledge spread quietly, erased later by new powers who claimed discovery rather than inheritance. To look at these stones is to feel both awe and amnesia. They are beautiful, yes, but unsettlingly so, like a melody half remembered from childhood. Something in their design stirs recognition, as though part of us remembers how such things were made. Perhaps that is why we are drawn to them. We sense that they are not foreign. They are fragments of a story we once knew by heart. In every era, people build monuments to themselves, but the builders of these works seem to have built for eternity. Their stones resist weather, war, and neglect. Even when bombed, they do not collapse. They bruise but remain upright. It is as if they were not meant to commemorate, but to endure, to wait. To hold, within their silent walls, the memory of a world that chose stone over words, knowing that words can be changed. Modern restoration teams clean and repaint these facades, unwittingly erasing clues with every layer of polish. Yet beneath the paint, the truth persists. A structure that refuses to age as it should. Marble that remains unstained. Metal that does not rust. Chemical tests puzzle laboratories. The results are quietly filed away. After all, anomalies are expensive to explain. And so we walk beneath their arches, tracing their symmetry with our eyes, unaware that we are passing through evidence, not of myth, but of mastery. We call them palaces, museums, or government halls, but perhaps they are artifacts, parts of a network older than the nations that now claim them. If so, they do not merely decorate our cities, they are times the ruins we seek, the proof that the past was stranger, brighter, and more advanced than we are allowed to imagine. What if the evidence of a forgotten civilization isn't lost, just hiding in plain sight, inside our own cities? Perhaps these stones were never meant to vanish. Perhaps they were meant to remind, quietly, persistently, until someone finally asked the forbidden question. Because in their presence, one truth becomes undeniable. Our world has forgotten more than it remembers. And as the camera pulls back from the grandeur of St. Petersburg, from the silent plains of Mongolia, from the ruins that refuse to die, a voice lingers in the air, soft, deliberate, almost mournful. Asterisk. But history is written by survivors, and rewritten by powers. In the flickering light of the 18th century, when empires stretched their borders like shadows at sunset, something subtle began to change, not in the soil or the sky, but in the story of the world itself. Across Eurasia, kings and scholars, explorers and priests, all seemed to reach the same quiet conclusion. History, like land, could be claimed. And once claimed, it could be redrawn. Printing presses multiplied. Books spread faster than armies. Knowledge, for the first time, could travel without a horse or a sail. Yet behind this flowering of enlightenment, a quieter revolution unfolded, one of classification, correction, and omission. Across the courts of Europe, new institutions arose with noble names: academies, societies, archives. Their purpose, it was said, was to preserve truth. But the truth they preserved was the truth that served. In Russia, Catherine the Great gathered historians to define the lineage of her empire. The project was grand, the ambition clear: to create a seamless story from chaos, to bind scattered tribes into an imperial past. But in doing so, entire centuries were compressed, erased, or reassigned. Old chronicles vanished into locked rooms. Ancient maps were quietly withdrawn. And when the great historical works were published, they spoke not of Tartaria, nor of the steppe kingdoms that once breathed under its name, but of Russian dominion, eternal, inevitable, ordained. In Britain, the rewriting took a subtler form. The age of empire required coherence, and coherence required a narrative. Scholars assembled in London's Royal Society and Oxford's libraries, dividing history into epochs: classical, medieval, modern. The classification felt scientific, objective, clean, yet in the process, the messy overlaps of the times that did not fit the mould were discarded. Cultures that could not be neatly dated were dismissed as legends or anomalies. The forgotten civilizations of the East were reduced to footnotes, their architectural marvels explained away as coincidences or misunderstandings. France followed its own script. After revolution came the desperate need for stability, and nothing stabilizes like an official past. Napoleon's savants marched with him, rewriting as they conquered. Ancient monuments were catalogued, measured, reinterpreted to fit a linear European narrative, one that placed France, conveniently, at its pinnacle. The Enlightenment had arrived, but so had control. History became a tool of order, a way to define what was civilized and what was not. Each empire claimed to be illuminating the dark, but perhaps what they illuminated most was their own reflection. What if the history you know was not discovered, but carefully edited? What if the past, as we are taught, was constructed less from evidence than from necessity? The 19th century turned this quiet editing into an industry. Encyclopedias replaced oral tradition. Textbooks standardized memory. And within those pages, countless variations of the past regional myths, suppressed manuscripts, contradictory timelines disappeared beneath the weight of agreement. Agreement, after all, is easier to rule than chaos. Librarians became gatekeepers, historians became architects, and soon the map of time itself looked as organized as the grids of modern cities. Every century had its label, every discovery its rightful place, every civilization its rank. But beyond that order lay a silence that no one dared question. What had been erased in the name of reason? What voices had been flattened beneath the smooth marble of progress? The clues still exist, scattered like cracks in the surface. Manuscripts reclassified under new titles, dates adjusted by decades to align with imperial chronologies. Archaeological reports quietly suppressed when they contradicted official timelines. Even the calendars shifted reforms that subtly altered the rhythm of recorded time. One by one, these edits accumulated until the shape of the past no longer matched its reflection. For most, the illusion worked. Children grew up learning the new sequence of events as if it had always been so. Nations took pride in stories that had never truly happened. And in that shared belief, the new world found its unity. To question it was to risk exile, obscurity, even ridicule. Those who sensed inconsistencies, explorers, linguists, rogue scholars, found their work ignored or mysteriously lost. The Great Historical Reset, as some later called it, was not a single moment but a slow erasure, a reweaving of the human story until the original threads were unrecognizable. Yet every reset leaves residue. Beneath rewritten chronicles lie older manuscripts, faint ink visible under ultraviolet light. Beneath polished monuments lie foundations that tell a different tale. In private collections and forgotten monasteries, alternate versions of history still whisper their contradictions. They tell of ages when trade routes spanned the world, long before empires claimed discovery, when maps showed coastlines centuries ahead of their supposed exploration, when great cities rose and fell under names now forbidden. Modern historians dismiss such evidence as error, as metaphor, as myth. But myths persist because something in them resists extinction. Perhaps these stories endure not because they are false, but because they are the fragments of a greater truth, one that no single empire could afford to remember. The 18th and 19th centuries gave humanity its first illusion of certainty. Time became a straight road, leading confidently from past to present. Progress was measurable, discovery was linear, and the notion that knowledge might have once been lost or deliberately hidden became almost unthinkable. But the cracks remain, faint and luminous, like constellations in the dark. Follow them, and a different sky appears. A world where timelines overlap, where civilizations rise unseen, where the same patterns repeat in new disguises. To understand this reset is not to accuse, but to see. History is not a crime scene. It is a mirror. Every age shapes its reflection to flatter itself. Yet the more carefully we smooth that image, the more distortions we create. Perhaps the real story of the past lies not in the polished glass of official records, but in the ripples beneath. Imagine for a moment, standing before a wall of old books, each spine a fragment of the human dream. Some are gilded, others torn. Together they form the story of us. Now imagine that, quietly, one by one, a few volumes are removed. The gaps close. The shelf still looks complete. Unless you knew what was missing, you'd never notice. That is how the great historical reset succeeded, not through destruction, but through rearrangement. And so the modern world inherited a perfect illusion. A history that fits neatly on a shelf, bound in logic, polished by consensus. But beneath that order lingers the echo of another world, one that once existed, and perhaps still does, beneath the surface of our own. Who decides what knowledge survives and what gets buried? The story of human knowledge has always been written in fragile ink paper, parchment, wood, clay. It survives by chance, not intention. And throughout history, the same scene has played out like an ancient ritual. A city trembles, a ruler changes, and the archives burn. In the smoke of those fires, entire civilizations vanish, not in body, but in memory. The first flames often come cloaked in purpose. In the late 18th century, as revolutions swept Europe, libraries became symbols of the old order. In Paris, during the Terror and its aftermath, manuscripts that predated the Republic were dragged into courtyards and fed to bonfires under banners of purification. Superstition, the mobs called it. Progress, said the officials. But when the smoke cleared, what remained was a silence that no enlightenment could fill. For every volume lost, an origin vanished, an idea without a name, a lineage without a root. Further east, another kind of cleansing unfolded. In the archives of Moscow and Kazan, imperial reformers ordered vast reclassification projects. Documents written in forgotten dialects, scrolls that blended science and myth, records of kingdoms that bore no modern equivalent, all were deemed irrelevant to the new chronology. Some were stored, others burned for warmth in the cruel winters. The rest were simply never seen again. Years later, witnesses whispered that in one night alone, whole cartloads of ancient manuscripts were consumed by fire near the Volga. What had they contained? No one could say. The official report described it as accidental. History, it seems, often rewrites itself in flames. Every empire burns the memory of another. But what if this time they burned the blueprint of civilization itself? In 1834, the Library of the Louvre, once the pride of France, caught fire under mysterious circumstances. It took with it thousands of irreplaceable texts from the East, collected during Napoleon's campaigns. Some scholars claim that among them were codices describing pre-Christian star maps and the remnants of unknown alphabets. Others dismissed these as rumor, convenient mythology for a nation seeking lost grandeur. Yet the pattern repeated. Alexandria had burned, Constantinople had burned, London had burned. Each time the story ended the same way. Knowledge turned to cinder, and silence filled its place. What makes these losses haunting is not their number, but their precision. Fires strike where the oldest knowledge sleeps: the archives, the observatories, the repositories of continuity. In 1904, when the Imperial Public Library of St. Petersburg suffered its own blaze, the flames spared the newer volumes, but consumed the ethnographic records of Siberia and the steppes regions once labelled Tartary on those ancient maps. Coincidence, perhaps. But coincidence has a strange rhythm when it repeats across centuries. In Asia, too, the pattern held. When Beijing's old summer palace fell in 1860, British and French troops looted what they could, then burned the rest. The smoke rose for 3 days, blotting out the sun. The palace had been more than a home. It was an archive of dynasties, containing manuscripts that bridged east and west. Those who witnessed the fire described it as if watching history itself unravel, thread by thread. And when the embers cooled, the Western powers called it a necessary punishment. Another past extinguished, another record cleansed. But fire is not the only destroyer. Neglect, too, can burn. In monasteries across Europe, manuscripts were scraped clean and rewritten to meet new theological fashions. Entire centuries of local chronicles were erased beneath layers of scripture and law. The palimpsests remain, their ghosts visible under ultraviolet light, old words, struggling to return through the new. They tell of vanished kings, altered borders, forgotten sciences. Each erasure a quiet death, each blank page a controlled amnesia. What drives this cycle? Fear, perhaps. Fear that the past holds too many versions of truth. To control the future, one must first control the story. Empires have always known this, and so the fires come, and the shelves collapse, and the world begins again, simpler, cleaner, more obedient. The people forget not because they wish to, but because forgetting is organized. Yet the ashes do not lie still. Every lost archive leaves behind a scent, faint, metallic, impossible to erase. Scholars decades later uncover fragments in private collections. A burned corner of parchment with symbols that match an unknown alphabet, a ledger of trade routes that shouldn't exist, a reference to a city that no longer appears on any map. Each discovery, a splinter from a burned tree, proof that once there was a forest. The emotional weight of these losses is not measured in pages, but in absences. Imagine the great vaults of Alexandria, their scrolls glowing gold in lamplight. Imagine the priests of Constantinople fleeing with bundles of manuscripts as walls crumbled. Imagine, centuries later, a single page surfacing in the market, a survivor of that inferno, passed from hand to trembling hand. Such relics remind us that memory, once burned, can never be fully rebuilt. The sentences may be reconstructed, but their music is gone. There is a strange paradox in this destruction. The more completely something is erased, the more it haunts. We sense its outline in the gaps. A missing link in a timeline, a rumor in an explorer's journal, a symbol carved where no language should be. Fire may destroy the record, but it also sanctifies the mystery. What we cannot verify, we begin to imagine, and imagination, in time, becomes its own archive. Perhaps this is why every great loss is followed by a revival of curiosity. After the flames die, the seekers appear. They sift through ash and rumor, piecing together the fragments that survived by accident or stubbornness. From these fragments, new histories are born, tentative, incomplete, yet alive. It is as though knowledge itself resists extinction, reassembling through those who dare to look back. Still, the question lingers like smoke. What was in those vanished tomes that threatened the powerful so deeply? Why is it always the oldest, most inconvenient records that burned first? Perhaps they contained more than facts. Perhaps they preserved a worldview incompatible with the age of industry and control. A world where energy flowed freely, where architecture resonated with the earth, where humanity understood itself as part of a continuum, not the apex of progress. The narrator pauses among the ruins, the air heavy with the ghost of parchment. The fires have burned, but the silence they left behind still glows faintly. Somewhere beneath modern cities, beneath rebuilt archives and renovated museums, the charred remains of forgotten truths rest, waiting for a question, for a spark of remembrance. When the libraries fell silent, the stones began to speak. There are buildings in this world that seem less constructed than revealed, as though stone itself remembered how to take shape. Their symmetry is flawless, their endurance defiant. They stand not as relics but as riddles, scattered across continents like pieces of an unfinished equation. Columns rise without visible seams, arches flow as though poured rather than built. At first glance, they are monuments to devotion or empire. But look closer, and the geometry begins to hum. In certain cathedrals, the domes are not merely decorative, they act like receivers. When measured, their curves align with natural frequencies of sound and vibration. The ancients, it seems, did not simply admire proportion, they understood its power. Resonance was their blueprint. When air moves through those halls, the stone vibrates imperceptibly, amplifying energy in ways modern engineers are only beginning to rediscover. The idea seems fantastical, yet the data whispers otherwise. Sensors placed in old basilicas have recorded frequencies that match modern resonant chambers, used today to study wave mechanics. Coincidence? Perhaps, or memory. Stones themselves bear strange scars. In parts of Central Asia, facades appear melted, as if once subjected to heat great enough to fuse granite into glass. Conventional fires cannot reach such temperatures. Even the tools required to smooth those surfaces do not fit the technology attributed to their supposed builders. In St. Petersburg, certain granite blocks weigh more than the cranes of the 18th century could ever lift. Yet they sit perfectly leveled, balanced on foundations that show no sign of adjustment. The question is not how they were carved, but how they were moved, and why. Modern engineers, when pressed, offer polite speculation. Primitive ingenuity, lost methods, teams of workers unknown in scale. Yet privately, many admit that even with today's machines, replicating such precision would be daunting. The joints between the stones are so tight that centuries of frost and flood have failed to widen them. The measurements are too consistent to be guesswork. It is as though these structures were shaped not by labor, but by manipulation of the material itself, a kind of controlled resonance or field effect that softened stone and froze it again, leaving behind surfaces smooth as poured metal. Around these anomalies, patterns emerge. Domes, spires, and towers form networks when plotted on maps, aligning with geomagnetic grids. The same alignments appear in distant lands, from Moscow's cathedrals to Samarkand's minarets, from Mongolian fortresses to European palaces. Their proportions echo one another as if tuned to a shared frequency, a forgotten code in stone. Modern instruments detect residual magnetism in some sites, faint but measurable. The magnetic north of those ages, they say, was not where it is today. But perhaps the builders were not mapping the Earth's magnetism. Perhaps they were shaping it. If this seems fanciful, consider the evidence of deliberate design. The domes of certain structures amplify not only sound, but electrical potential. When lightning strikes nearby, these domes attract and diffuse charge, channeling it along metallic veins embedded within the walls. In some ruins, oxidized copper and iron rods still trace the paths of what might once have been energy conduits. Historians call them decorative or symbolic, but to the trained eye, they resemble the skeleton of a circuit, a system for gathering, storing, and dispersing natural energy long before electricity was formally understood. Throughout Eurasia, architectural motifs repeat like refrains. The onion dome, the gilded spire, the central atrium crowned with metallic finials. Each element behaves in accordance with principles of resonance and electrostatic induction. To the modern visitor, they are aesthetic. To the ancient builder, perhaps they were functional. What if the ancients didn't just build, they engineered energy? The notion alters perspective. Cathedrals cease to be mere temples. They become instruments. Palaces transform into amplifiers. The placement of towers along rivers begins to resemble a network, rather than coincidence, a system for harnessing currents not of water, but of the air itself. Travelers' journals from centuries past occasionally note strange sensations. Metallic taste in the mouth near certain domes, hair standing on end during clear days, the crackle of unseen force. Such details were dismissed as poetic embellishment, yet they match phenomena observed near high-voltage environments. Across the Atlantic, the pattern repeats in the New World buildings of uncanny similarity, appearing suddenly in colonial cities, their style too advanced for the time. Were they replicas inspired by the Old World, or remnants of the same forgotten science transplanted across continents? The records are contradictory, as if someone stitched two eras together with invisible thread. Even in ruin, the mystery persists. The stones seem alive under sunlight, conducting heat differently from their surroundings. Some researchers claim that mineral compositions have been subtly altered microstructures aligned, as if polarized by magnetism. When exposed to frequency tests, these stones respond like resonant crystals. The sound hums faintly through them, echoing the curvature of their design. The implications, if true, are unsettling. It would mean that our ancestors, or those who came before them, understood energy as a natural force to be tuned, not generated. They may have drawn it from the earth, from the atmosphere, from the very geometry of the planet. Architecture, then, was not static, but interactive, a living interface between human intention and environmental power. Skeptics point to imagination, to pattern-seeking minds desperate for mystery. Yet science itself was born from imagination. Every discovery begins as wonder before it becomes law. If even one fragment of this theory holds, it would mean that history has underestimated not only the skill of the ancients, but the sophistication of their worldview. Perhaps they saw no divide between science and spirituality, between matter and energy. Their temples were laboratories, their cathedrals, engines of prayer and power intertwined. Today, as we rebuild cities with steel and concrete, we no longer listen to the harmonies of form. Our architecture is functional, silent. Yet those old domes still sing. Stand beneath one at dawn, and you may feel it, a faint vibration in the chest, a warmth that defies explanation. It is as though the structure remembers what we have forgotten. If we could decode that language of resonance, we might rediscover more than lost technology. We might recover a philosophy, a way of living with the forces around us, rather than conquering them. The ancients, it seems, built not for display, but for dialogue. Their stones speak to the earth, their domes whisper to the sky. And so, when you gaze upon those impossible facades, remember that the boundary between art and engineering is thin, and that every mystery leaves a trace. Perhaps these monuments were not meant to impress, but to remind us of what once was possible and what could be again. If they mastered energy, where did that power go? In the quiet hum of a storm, when the air tastes metallic and every hair stands on end, something ancient stirs a conversation between the sky and the ground that predates every invention we call modern. Long before the age of copper wires and silicon, people watched lightning not as danger but as language. They built towers, domes, and spires that seemed to reach out to that living current. We call them monuments now, yet their forms echo the same principles our laboratories rediscovered centuries later. The story of atmospheric electricity is not a tale of discovery, but of remembering. The skies have always carried charge. The earth has always pulsed with invisible rhythm. Between them flows an endless dialogue, what scientists today describe as the global electrical circuit. Every storm, every breeze, every cloud plays its part. Yet, somehow, our ancestors may have understood how to listen to that current, and perhaps how to speak through it. When Nikola Tesla stood in his laboratory in the late 1800s, sending arcs of lightning dancing across the room, he believed he was glimpsing the future. His dream was to make electricity free and boundless, drawn from the very air. But what if it wasn't a vision of what could be, but of what once was? Across old sketches, paintings, and blueprints, labelled Tartarian, similar motifs appear. Tall towers topped with metallic spheres, domes crowned with rods, delicate lattices that resemble antennae. At first, they seem ornamental. Yet, when analysed by modern engineers, their design hints at something eerily functional, the ability to attract, store, and distribute charge. The idea of free energy often drifts into the realm of fantasy, dismissed as pseudoscience. But what makes it compelling is not blind faith. It's the fragments that refuse to align with official timelines. In archives across Europe and Asia, engravings from the 1700s depict machines that appear to generate static power, glowing lamps that predate electricity's accepted history. Some show metallic spheres suspended from ceilings, others towers ringed with copper. Scholars label them allegorical. Artists, they say, were dreaming of celestial order, not technology. Yet the patterns repeat too precisely to be coincidence. Consider the domes and spires of older cathedrals. Many are connected by underground channels lined with conductive stone and metal. In certain ruins, residual magnetism remains measurable even after centuries. The same principles govern Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower, designed to draw atmospheric charge and transmit it wirelessly across great distances. The resemblance is haunting. It is as if the past had already built what the future would later patent. And then there are the lightning rods, those silent sentinels of the sky. Officially, they were invented in the 18th century by Benjamin Franklin, a triumph of Enlightenment reason. But on older buildings, in lands untouched by his influence, similar devices stand proud. Some are crowned with finials shaped like spheres, some tipped with intricate fractal patterns meant to diffuse charge. They appear in places with no record of Franklin or his peers. Were they protection against storms? Or something more? Modern atmospheric physicists acknowledge that the air is a reservoir of energy, measurable, tangible, immense. Every cubic meter contains electrical potential. Yet humanity, for all its progress, has never mastered the art of drawing from it efficiently. Tesla tried and was silenced, his tower dismantled, his notes scattered. His vision of endless, wireless energy, a world without power grids or poverty, was too dangerous to finance. But if that knowledge had existed before, as the architecture suggests, who benefited from its disappearance? When the ancients built their cities, they often aligned them to geomagnetic lines, placing tall, conductive structures at their heart. Some believe these acted as harmonic nodes, drawing charge from the atmosphere and distributing it through the stone network below, not as electricity in our modern sense, but as an ambient vitality that could power devices, purify water, or illuminate structures. The evidence is elusive, but tantalizing. Certain metals recovered from these ruins bear traces of oscillating magnetic fields. Some domes emit faint static even today, as though remembering the flow they once carried. To walk through such a place is to feel an echo, a hum, just beyond hearing, a prickle on the skin when you brush your hand against the stone. Our ancestors may have lived in a world more alive than ours, a world humming softly with invisible energy, where buildings breathed like organs of a planetary machine. They may have understood that energy was not something to be generated, but to be tuned, a constant symphony between earth and sky. In this light, Tesla becomes not a prophet, but a translator. He spoke the forgotten language of resonance, the rhythm that once pulsed through ancient domes and spires. His inventions mirrored their geometry, the coils, the spheres, the grounding rods. Perhaps he stumbled upon an echo of a civilization that had already solved the equation. The question is not whether he was first, but who came before him. And then there is the silence, the deliberate absence in our records. Texts describing etheric power, early electrical experiments, and natural resonance were systematically discredited or destroyed in the early 20th century. As industrial power networks expanded, the idea of drawing energy freely from the environment became taboo. Progress was defined by consumption, not connection. The age of harmony gave way to the age of control. But every so often, the veil flickers. Researchers rediscover forgotten patterns, lost diagrams, unexplainable machines that seem both modern and ancient. A few experiment quietly, building small replicas of towers designed centuries ago, finding strange results. Bulbs glowing faintly with no wires, magnets resonating without contact. Science demands replication, mystery demands patience. The two rarely walk together, but when they do, the ground shifts. What if technology isn't discovered, but remembered? The question is dangerous precisely because it suggests continuity, that human civilization might not be a ladder of progress, but a cycle of amnesia. Each reset erases not ignorance, but mastery. The ruins we study might not be primitive attempts at greatness, but the surviving bones of an age that once understood the Earth's heartbeat. Even now, our skies crackle with untapped power. The Schumann resonances ripple above us. The ionosphere glows with perpetual voltage. Lightning dances across the horizon, carrying energy enough to light continents. Yet we remain tethered to fuel and flame. Perhaps the ancients looked up and saw not chaos, but pattern, and built accordingly. If their towers once drank from the heavens, if their domes once hummed with invisible force, then the question becomes not how, but why it ended. Did they lose control? Did nature shift? Or was the knowledge itself silenced, locked away by those who saw danger in freedom? As the camera pans across the glimmering domes of forgotten cities, across the ruins that still hum faintly with the pulse of the planet, a final thought settles like static in the air. Maybe the power never vanished. Maybe it still waits, patient as stone, in the space between the storm and the ground. Who decided humanity wasn't ready for such knowledge? There has never been a time in human history when truth and power stood on equal ground. One thrives in light, the other survives in control. The moment truth begins to challenge authority, the war on memory begins. It rarely announces itself with flames or decrees. More often, it unfolds quietly through edits, omissions, polite condemnations dressed as reason. When truth threatens power, power writes history. From the earliest empires to modern institutions, the pattern repeats. In ancient Alexandria, the library was not only a sanctuary of learning, it was a battlefield of ideas. Scholars from every land debated under the same roof, but their discoveries often collided with the doctrines of kings and priests. Knowledge, for all its beauty, was dangerous. When new theories disrupted the divine order, scrolls vanished, and names were erased. Civilization marched forward, but only along paths deemed safe. Centuries later, the same struggle resurfaced under different flags. The Church's Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of forbidden books, stretched for hundreds of titles, each one representing a voice silenced. Galileo's telescope revealed a universe larger than theology could comfortably hold, and for that, his truth was confined. He was not burned or broken, he was buried in reputation. Silence became the more efficient punishment. Every generation learns this lesson anew. You don't have to destroy a man's work to erase him, you simply convince the world to stop listening. The Enlightenment, often celebrated as the dawn of reason, was also the birth of new gatekeepers. Science liberated thought from dogma, but in doing so, it replaced one priesthood with another. The language of faith was traded for the language of proof, and both were guarded with equal fervor. Institutions arose to verify truth academies, journals, societies. At first, their mission was noble, to protect knowledge from superstition, but soon, protection became policing. Anything that challenged the accepted framework was exiled from legitimacy, and like heretics before them, dissenting thinkers were branded not as seekers, but as fools. History's great suppression rarely looks like tyranny. It looks like consensus. It hides behind phrases like peer review, authority, official record. But consensus, by its nature, resists contradiction. Once established, it becomes a wall, and behind that wall, countless forgotten truths accumulate like dust. Consider how many discoveries emerged decades after their first rejection. The circulation of the blood, the existence of microbes, the continental drift, each was dismissed, mocked, or ignored before it became canon. Progress, it seems, moves not in straight lines, but in long detours through disbelief. When civilizations centralize power, they inevitably centralize memory. Control the record, and you control the future. Monarchs commissioned their own historians, painting victory where there was defeat, order where there was chaos. Empires redrew maps to erase rival cultures, renaming rivers and mountains as acts of conquest. Even language itself became a weapon. When words disappear, so do the ideas they once carried. The loss of a tongue is not merely cultural, it is intellectual extinction. Each vanished dialect takes with it a way of perceiving the world that no other language can replace. Religious censorship and scientific monopoly may seem like opposites, yet they share a single motive: the preservation of narrative authority. One claims to protect faith, the other to protect fact, but both guard the same treasure, the right to define what is real. Those who threaten that definition become enemies not of truth, but of order. For power, order is sacred, chaos is heresy, and the easiest way to create order is to erase the inconvenient. The printing press once promised liberation. Words could no longer be contained by walls. But even as the presses multiplied, ownership of knowledge consolidated. Those who funded publication decided which voices were amplified and which were silenced. In every century, the pattern repeats: invention followed by restriction, awakening followed by suppression. Each wave of discovery births its own keepers, and each keeper, in time, becomes its own censor. Sometimes suppression wears the face of mercy. Authorities tell the public that certain truths would be too dangerous, that they would sow panic, undermine faith, threaten progress. They call it protection, but the effect is the same. Humanity is shielded not from falsehood, but from its own potential. Knowledge is rationed like medicine, administered only by those deemed qualified to dispense it. And so, across generations, entire fields of inquiry vanish into academic obscurity, sealed off by jargon and institutional pride. The war on memory is fought not only in libraries and laboratories, but within us. Each person learns to question only within permitted boundaries. We inherit skepticism that stops just short of heresy. It's a subtle conditioning, the invisible fence around curiosity. The stories we tell ourselves about the past are curated to maintain coherence. Too many contradictions, and the structure falters. So the mind, like the archive, edits itself. It forgets for comfort. Still, now and then, the cracks appear. A suppressed manuscript resurfaces. A forgotten inventor's patent is rediscovered. A lost chronicle emerges from the dust of an old monastery. Each revelation reminds us that the past is not as complete as we imagine. Beneath the official record lies a parallel history, one written in erased names, in censored lines, in burned margins. And each time we uncover one of these fragments, we see the same truth reflected, that control of knowledge has always been the quiet engine of civilization. To question this order is not rebellion, it is remembrance. For every Galileo silenced, there is another voice waiting to rise. Truth, though buried, remains restless. It seeps through the cracks in every era, whispering to those who still listen. Power can delay it, but never destroy it. The record can be rewritten, but not forever. As centuries pass, the methods evolve. The bonfires of the past have been replaced by subtler flames, digital censorship, algorithmic erasure, selective preservation. The technology changes, but the instinct remains the same. Humanity fears unfiltered truth because it demands responsibility. To know everything would be to face ourselves. Perhaps the real war on memory is not waged by kings or institutions, but by our own comfort with ignorance. It is easier to live within the curated world than to step into the uncertain one. But without confronting that uncertainty, we lose something greater than knowledge, we lose the right to wonder. And so the narrator lingers in the quiet halls of forgotten history, surrounded by the ghosts of silenced thinkers. The air feels heavy, as if the walls themselves remember what we have chosen to forget. In that stillness, one question rises a bridge to what comes next. What happens when suppression becomes industrialized? The modern world prides itself on memory archives digitized, libraries infinite, histories indexed down to the day. Yet beneath this illusion of remembrance lies a quiet paradox. The more perfectly we record, the less we seem to remember. Somewhere along the path of progress, memory itself became mechanical, and in that transformation, something human was lost. The machinery of forgetting was born not from malice, but from order, from the need to shape a coherent world out of the chaos of the past. In the 19th century, as the great empires turned into nations, education became their most powerful invention. For the first time, entire populations could be instructed to see history the same way. Children in Russia, France, or Britain were taught not just arithmetic or grammar, but allegiance and narrative of belonging built upon carefully chosen memories. What they learnt was not the world as it had been, but the world as their leaders wished it to appear. Textbooks replaced oral traditions, and within a generation, what was once remembered by the fireside became nothing more than a myth on the margins. The printing press, once hailed as humanity's liberation, became its quiet regulator. When a handful of publishers controlled what was printed, they controlled what was real. Mass literacy allowed ideas to spread, but it also made them easier to standardize. The same book could appear in 1,000 classrooms, each line identical, each omission duplicated faithfully. History, for the first time, became a product, a story distributed like merchandise, stamped with the seal of authority. In the new industrial age, truth began to flow through factories. Printing presses churned not only newspapers, but worldviews. Each headline defined what mattered, each omission what did not. As the machines thundered, they engraved new hierarchies into human consciousness. Progress over tradition, the present over the past, conformity over complexity. The world began to move faster than memory could follow, and so we learned to forget efficiently. Schools soon became the assembly lines of identity. Desks replaced apprenticeships. Examinations replaced experience. The young learned to recite the past, not to question it. Their minds were organized into subjects, their questions categorized into disciplines. Knowledge became compartmentalized, and so did truth. A child in London or Moscow could now grow up believing that civilization had unfolded in a single linear direction: primitive, medieval, modern. It was a comforting sequence, smooth and unquestionable, like the ticking of a clock. But beneath its rhythm, older layers of history, inconvenient, ambiguous, untamed, were quietly erased. Perhaps we didn't forget Tartaria, we were taught never to remember. Consider the architecture of learning itself. The classroom, with its rows of desks facing a single authority, mirrors the very hierarchy it instills. The blackboard, once a symbol of illumination, becomes a screen where memory is projected and replaced each day. Knowledge flows one way from the certified to the receptive, from the approved to the impressionable. It is not dialogue, it is broadcast. And as generations pass through this system, the range of what can be questioned narrows. The curriculum becomes a boundary, and beyond it lies only myth. The same principle extended to culture. As printing and broadcasting matured, a uniform memory spread across borders. The 20th century's cinema, radio, and television became the new library's visual textbooks teaching entire populations how to feel about the past. Stories were simplified to fit the lens, complexities flattened into symbols. The grand civilizations of the steppe, the enigmatic cities of the East, the strange parallels between distant cultures, all were edited down, streamlined into a narrative of Western progress. What did not fit the model was omitted. Propaganda, once a tool of monarchs and popes, evolved into a system without a single author. Governments, advertisers, educators, all contributed to a shared illusion that history was settled, complete, and knowable, and so the machinery of forgetting became self-sustaining. It required no censors, only repetition. Say something long enough, print it wide enough, and it becomes fact. The past, like a photograph overexposed to light, began to fade at its edges. Even science was drawn into the system. As disciplines professionalized, curiosity became regulated by funding and publication. Theories that strayed too far from consensus were quietly starved of oxygen. The great scientific revolutions, once born from eccentric minds and solitary experiments, now required approval, budgets, peer reviews. Discovery itself became institutionalized, and mystery was rebranded as error. What could not be replicated within the machinery was dismissed as myth, regardless of evidence. This was the hidden cost of progress, the exchange of wonder for uniformity. The age of information gave rise to an age of managed knowledge, and in the process, we traded curiosity for certainty. Every system built to preserve truth schools, archives, databases also became a filter, deciding what was worth keeping. And once something is filtered out, it is almost impossible to retrieve. Forgetting became efficient, automated, invisible. But the machinery does not work perfectly. Even the most polished gears leave residue small imperfections where light still slips through. A misplaced photograph, a mistranslated footnote, an unapproved theory that refuses to die. These fragments form the fingerprints of the forgotten. They are the anomalies that historians quietly skip over, the ruins that don't match their blueprints, the stories that echo faintly through folklore, despite every attempt to silence them. When we examine how collective memory narrows, we are not seeing conspiracy so much as evolution. Systems evolve to maintain stability, and stability depends on coherence. The machinery of forgetting protects us from chaos, but it also protects chaos from us. It ensures that certain questions remain unasked, that certain doors stay closed. And yet, somewhere deep within the human spirit, the impulse to remember persists. Every generation rediscovers something it was told to ignore. In this, there is hope. Because even erased stories leave fingerprints. The ink may fade, the stones may crumble, but patterns endure in architecture, in myth, in the strange synchronicities that tie distant cultures together. The machinery of forgetting can suppress memory, but it cannot erase the instinct to seek. And so, the camera lingers on an empty classroom, dust floating in the light from tall windows. The chalkboard is blank now, but faint outlines of old lessons remain half-erased equations, the ghosts of sentences once written in certainty. Outside, the world hums with the machinery of progress, confident in its version of history. But beneath the noise, something else stirs a pulse, faint but steady, reminding us that memory, no matter how buried, always finds a way to return. Because even the most efficient forgetting cannot silence what wants to be known. And soon, those faint fingerprints will lead to rediscovery, to the hidden record, waiting beneath the official one, ready to speak once more. Beneath the marble floors of the world's grandest museums, past the polished galleries where visitors move in reverent silence, lie rooms few ever see. Behind locked iron doors and dust-choked stairwells, the temperature drops, the air grows dry, and the world above feels very far away. Here, among shelves of forgotten ledgers and crates labelled in fading ink, the past is not displayed, it waits. Archivists call them non-catalogued collections. Historians call them mysteries. But to those who listen closely, they sound like ghosts breathing through the paper. In the quiet of forgotten basements, history still breathes. The journey begins in St. Petersburg. Beneath the old Academy of Sciences, a labyrinth of stone corridors built to house the records of the empire. A young researcher, sorting through boxes of untranslated manuscripts, discovers maps that never made it into official circulation. They show borders that no longer exist, rivers flowing under names now erased, and there, sprawling across the northern steppes, a word inked in bold, confident strokes. Asterisk Tartaria. Asterisk, not a myth, not a legend, but a state drawn, measured, labelled as fact. On the back, in another hand, a note reads simply, obsolete. Far to the west, in the archives of London, similar anomalies rest under layers of bureaucratic dust. A series of 18th century atlases lists Tartary alongside China, Persia, and the Ottoman Empire. But in later editions, the name disappears, replaced by a blank space or absorbed into Russia and Mongolia. The change is so seamless that few notice. The cartographers left no explanation. Only the earliest copies bear the mark of an empire that official history quietly exhaled. When confronted with such contradictions, archivists shrug. Transitional naming, they say. A cartographic relic. Yet relics tell stories, and these tell of something once vast enough to require recognition and erasure. In Paris, within the Musée de l'Homme, a similar story unfolds. Deep within storage vaults meant for anthropological specimens, crates of labelled fragments lie unopened since the 19th century. When re-examined, some reveal origins inconsistent with their assigned regions. Textiles marked as Turkish resemble Central Asian designs centuries older. In one box, a brass device shaped like a miniature dome bears inscriptions in an unknown hybrid of Cyrillic and Sanskrit. Its record card, written in hurried French, reads, "Unknown, possibly Tartarian." The word feels out of place in a scientific archive, like a whisper interrupting a lecture. Every archive has these moments of fracture evidence that refuses to fit, objects mislabeled because they disobey chronology. They are the phantom threads connecting histories thought separate. Curators learn to pass over them, not out of conspiracy, but fatigue. There is never enough time, funding, or will to question everything that contradicts the system. And so the anomalies remain sealed, sleeping. But when someone lifts the lid, dust motes swirl in the light like the spirits of old truths, persistent, unburned. Beyond Europe, in forgotten corners of Asia, provincial museums hold even stranger collections. In Ulaanbaatar, a small, unvisited room contains fragments of architecture, carved marble faces, metallic finials shaped like lightning rods, stone blocks fused by heat. Their catalogue descriptions are sparse. Most bear no origin date. One curator, when asked, admits that local legends speak of a lost northern empire, though such talk is discouraged. Still, the artifacts are there, too well crafted to dismiss as folklore. If you listen closely, even the silence of the room seems to murmur with withheld memory. The digital age has done little to simplify this puzzle. In online databases, references to Tartary persist like faint fingerprints, buried in scanned manuscripts and travelogues. A 1,765 encyclopedia lists it as a vast and populous region. A British gazetteer from 1824 calls it an empire stretching from the Caspian to the Pacific. None of these authors doubted its existence. Yet within a few decades the name was gone, as though a hand had passed over the map and smoothed it away. When the term re-emerged in modern times, it did so only as rumour, stripped of its legitimacy. But the archives remember. They always do. To walk through these rooms is to feel a strange intimacy with absence. Every crate unopened, every label smudged, becomes a metaphor for civilization's selective memory. You can almost hear the faint creak of the shelves, the sigh of the air conditioning, as if the building itself were exhaling forgotten truths. The archivists who maintain these spaces are not villains, they are guardians of contradiction. Many of them know what lies beneath the surface documents too fragile or too inconvenient to display. They speak carefully, aware that to question the record too loudly is to risk professional exile. Yet in private, over tea or dim light, they admit what the official histories cannot, that the evidence of lost nations still rests in their care. What fascinates most is not the existence of these archives, but their tone, the quiet refusal to draw conclusions. They present data without narrative, facts without emotion. Yet the absence of commentary is itself a story. It is as if the curators, knowing the weight of what they hold, chose silence over speculation. Each sealed box, each mislabeled item, is a kind of moral pause, a space between knowing and saying. And in that pause, imagination begins to breathe again. Every civilization leaves traces of what it tries to erase. Ink fades, languages die, but records are stubborn. A misfiled page in a government ledger, a travel diary forgotten in an attic, a misprinted map, these become the fossils of truth. They are not dramatic proofs, but quiet patterns, aligning like stars, once thought random. Each new discovery adds weight to an old suspicion. That the world once knew of a vast northern realm, advanced and organized enough to command the attention of empires, and that its disappearance was not the result of myth, but of deliberate omission. Somewhere deep in the archives of Vienna, a curator finds an 1812 trade report mentioning Tartarian merchants dealing in precision instruments and alloys of remarkable composition. The letter bears an imperial seal but no follow-up. No later records confirm such trade. Yet the handwriting is genuine, the references specific. The document's authenticity is beyond doubt, its implications inconvenient. It is quietly placed back into storage, logged as unverified context. The past exhales again, unheard. This is how civilizations vanish, not through catastrophe, but through cataloguing. A shift in labels, a redrawing of borders, an adjustment of definitions, and entire nations dissolve into academic footnotes. The evidence remains, but the meaning is gently drained away. Still, the ghosts of the archives do not sleep forever. Every generation produces a few who hear their whisper, who follow a misfiled code, who open a drawer no one remembers locking. In that moment, history stirs, blinking against the light. For a brief instant, we glimpse the outline of a world we were never meant to see, one that existed in plain sight, until someone decided to close the book. In the quiet of forgotten basements, history still breathes, and as its lungs fill again with curiosity, a new question rises with the dust. How much of what we call discovery is really rediscovery? Because even beneath centuries of misdirection, truth leaves traces too stubborn to erase. And those traces are leading us somewhere new, toward the digital resurrection of what was lost, where forgotten words and ancient maps begin to awaken once more. In a quiet room lit only by the glow of screens, the ghosts of lost civilizations awaken pixel by pixel. Across the hum of servers and the whisper of keystrokes, a new kind of archaeology is taking shape, one that digs not through sand or stone, but through data. Files once buried in private collections, maps fading in forgotten libraries, fragments of languages too obscure to translate all, are returning to light through the tireless work of digital resurrection. The past, once bound by ink and dust, is learning to breathe again through electricity. For centuries, the remains of vanished histories have been scattered, a map here, a diary there, an artifact mislabeled and misplaced. But now, as technology folds distance into seconds, these fragments find one another again. Artificial intelligence scans millions of documents, recognizing patterns no human eye could see. Algorithms trace recurring symbols, cross-referencing forgotten alphabets with known ones, weaving connections that scholars of the past might have called impossible. What once required decades of travel and correspondence can now unfold in a single night's work. The more we connect, the more the erased begin to return. Across the digital world, independent researchers act as modern explorers, sailing through oceans of scanned pages instead of open seas. An archivist in Prague finds a 1,790 seconds engraving, labeled Times Grand Tartary Times, and uploads it. Within hours, a linguist in India recognizes a phrase in the margin. A student in Canada overlays the map on modern satellite imagery and notices that its borders align not with myth, but with river systems still visible today. Every connection becomes a spark, and in those sparks, the shadows of lost empires flicker back into view. The internet, once dismissed as chaotic, has become the new library of Alexandria, vast, fragile, and filled with miracles. Digital archives once locked behind paywalls are opening to public eyes. Museums are scanning their collections, giving voice to the silent corridors where forgotten objects rested for centuries. With every upload, history expands not linearly, but holographically. Each image, each rediscovered page, adds dimension to what we thought we knew. The collective act of remembering has become democratized. Anyone, anywhere, can now play the role of the historian, the translator, the seeker. AI restoration tools reconstruct documents thought beyond saving. Burned manuscripts reveal faint letters invisible to the naked eye. Lost paintings regain color as algorithms fill the gaps left by time. Old photographs of ruins are layered with modern drone footage, revealing alignments too deliberate to dismiss. The fragments that once stood alone begin to form constellations. And as they connect, a truth long buried becomes harder to deny. Memory can be erased by hand, but not by network. Something poetic happens in this process. The same technology that once fragmented our attention now repairs our understanding. The same internet that drowned us in noise becomes a tuning instrument for the forgotten. The boundaries between scholar and dreamer blur. A coder becomes a historian. A historian becomes a detective. A student with no credentials uncovers what institutions missed. Knowledge no longer flows from top to bottom, it spreads like roots through soil, finding nourishment in every corner of curiosity. Among these rediscoveries are hundreds of references to the old maps of Tartary, found not in conspiracy forums but in legitimate archives, maritime charts, trade documents, and travel logs long ignored. AI-assisted translation reveals patterns of description, consistent names, consistent borders, consistent cultural markers. None of them match the mythic fantasy empire dismissed by modern historians. Instead, they speak of something structured, administrative, tangible. Each recovered text is a whisper growing louder, a suggestion that perhaps we have misread the silence of history as absence rather than erasure. Digital imaging has begun to do what time itself could not: resurrect context. Old palaces thought to be purely decorative reveal geometric resonances when modeled in 3D. Reconstructed city plans show impossible symmetry with energy lines once dismissed as coincidence. Even sound, the forgotten dimension of ancient architecture, returns when simulations reproduce the acoustics of vaulted domes. The past is no longer a relic to observe, but an environment to step into. There is wonder in the idea that circuits and servers can do what empires could not: restore what was destroyed. When one archive burns, another can be rebuilt in code. Knowledge, once scattered, now gathers in invisible space, immune to borders, censorship, and the decay of paper. Every upload is an act of defiance against forgetting. Every restoration, a spark of defibrillation for memory itself. The digital world becomes a sanctuary where lost knowledge can wait safely for rediscovery, beyond the reach of those who once buried it. Yet this resurrection is not without mystery. The more we uncover, the less certain the official narrative becomes. With every restored map, new contradictions emerge. Dates shift. Boundaries overlap. Entire epochs appear misaligned. The deeper we dig, the more it feels as if history itself has been written backward, as though the ruins we find are not traces of an ancient past, but of a future we were never meant to inherit. Still, optimism hums beneath the uncertainty. Humanity is remembering how to remember. Where once the archives burned, now they expand exponentially. No single hand controls this memory. It belongs to the collective, to the countless eyes, minds, and hearts across the world, drawn to the same quiet miracle of rediscovery. Each digital artifact becomes a seed planted in the soil of global consciousness, waiting to bloom into understanding. When the camera pulls back, We see millions of screens glowing in the dark, an invisible constellation of curiosity spanning continents. From basements and attics, from universities and anonymous servers, fragments of the forgotten world are being pieced together. It is as if the lost library of Alexandria has been reborn, not in marble, but in the infinite sky of data. The past no longer needs to be unearthed. It needs to be decoded. And as more minds connect, the message grows clearer. That knowledge was never truly lost, only waiting for the tools to hear it again. The digital resurrection is not just a technological triumph, it is a human one. It proves that curiosity is stronger than censorship, that memory adapts faster than control, and that even the faintest whisper of truth can find its way home through the noise. But as the recovered images sharpen, as forgotten languages find their voice, one question lingers like static on the edge of revelation, a question that will guide us into what comes next. What if we've been reading history backward? Time, we are told, is the one constant, the silent thread that binds all things together. It moves forward, unbroken, impartial, reliable. Yet the deeper we look into history, the more this thread begins to fray. The dates blur, the sequences falter, and entire centuries seem to echo one another like verses in a repeating song. The past, it turns out, is less a straight road than a labyrinth. And in that labyrinth, even the most careful traveller can lose their way. Historians call it chronology, the science of ordering time. It is the skeleton of history, the invisible grid that gives shape to memory. But what if that grid was drawn incorrectly? What if, somewhere along the way, the bones of the past were rearranged not maliciously, but by the simple fallibility of those who recorded it? What if time itself was edited? Consider the curious symmetry of invention. Across the ages, technologies appear to bloom in isolation, yet with uncanny resemblance. In ancient China, Greek scholars, and medieval Islamic texts alike, we find descriptions of mechanisms strikingly similar. Gears, levers, water clocks, even steam devices. Centuries apart, different tongues, same ideas as if humanity keeps rediscovering the same knowledge after each reset. The telescope, the printing press, the concept of electricity, all seem to emerge not as linear progressions, but as resurgences. Echoes of something older breaking through the surface. The same happens in architecture. Gothic cathedrals of medieval Europe display geometries so precise they rival modern engineering, yet official timelines place their builders in an age of superstition and stone tools. Across the world, in Central Asia, temples from supposedly separate centuries mirror these same patterns, down to the alignment of their arches and the frequency of their domes. Either coincidence has an extraordinary imagination, or our measurements of time have been misfiled. Chronological anomalies litter the record like misplaced pages. Documents contradict one another not by decades, but by entire epochs. Reigns overlap where they should not. Celestial events appear twice. Plagues repeat under different names. Some scholars have dared to suggest that parts of our calendar, perhaps even centuries, were artificially stretched or compressed. The motivations, if any, remain speculative. To synchronize power across regions, to align dynasties, to erase confusion. Yet in correcting the clock, history may have dislocated itself. Even the physical layers of the earth whisper contradiction. Archaeologists uncover artifacts whose craftsmanship predates the civilizations they are attributed to. In Turkey's Göbekli Tepe, precision stonework appears millennia before the rise of agriculture. In Siberia, metal objects have been found embedded in strata older than human industry. And in the ruins of forgotten cities, techniques surface that defy the supposed timeline of knowledge, alloys too advanced, glass too pure, masonry too precise. Time seems to resist our categories, folding and unfolding in unpredictable ways. Perhaps the error lies not in malice, but in method. Our ancestors measured time not as we do. Their calendars followed the stars, the moon, the rhythm of floods and harvests. When those systems converged under empires, translation introduced confusion. Years became longer, months rearranged, events retold under new rulers. A war fought in one century could, through misalignment, reappear centuries later under another name. We think of the past as a sequence, yet it might be a collage, fragments of simultaneous stories stitched together for coherence. There is a haunting beauty in this thought, that time itself might have layers, and that we, living in one, are merely peering through the transparency of another. When you hold two old maps against the light, their coastlines never align perfectly, yet both are true in their own way. History may work the same. Each age redraws the world in its image, unaware that the outlines beneath still shimmer faintly through. Evidence of such misalignment appears in more subtle forms too, in art, myth, and collective déjà vu. Entire epochs seem to repeat their patterns, a golden age, a fall, a rebirth. Empires rise on the same principles, invent the same machines, worship the same symbols under new names. We call it coincidence. Perhaps it is memory. A civilization remembering itself through time, looping until the lesson is learned. To suggest this is not to accuse historians of deceit, but to acknowledge the fragility of human record. Calendars are inventions, not absolutes. Every reform, every translation, every missing manuscript nudges time slightly out of sync. Over millennia, those nudges accumulate into fractures wide enough for entire civilizations to slip through. 1,000 years may stand where only 500 truly passed, or vanish where centuries once stood. The result is not a falsified history, but a distorted one, a mirror cracked by good intentions. If this idea feels disorienting, it should. We have built our sense of identity on continuity, on the belief that we stand at the culmination of a steady climb from ignorance to knowledge. But if time has been misfiled, then the ladder may be a circle, progress may be repetition. And the civilizations we call ancient may not be ancestors, but reflections of ourselves seen through warped glass. Science has begun, cautiously, to confront these questions. Astronomical records, eclipses, comets, planetary alignments are being reanalyzed with modern tools. Some no longer match the dates assigned to them. Geological layers reveal disasters and recoveries at intervals too regular to fit the accepted story. Even genetic timelines show unexpected accelerations and gaps, as if evolution itself mirrored the distortions of recorded time. To imagine that time might fold is to entertain a terrifying possibility that what we call history is a reconstruction, not a record. The past may have been edited not by conspiracy, but by necessity. Every civilization simplifies its story to survive. In doing so, it erases the contradictions that threaten coherence. Yet in those contradictions lies the truer, stranger tale of humanity, a tale of cycles, of rediscovery, of knowledge rising and falling like the tide. What if time itself was edited? The question lingers, not as accusation, but as invitation. To explore it is to admit that truth may not follow the calendar, that we live not at the end of a journey, but somewhere within a repeating pattern, still unfolding. And if timelines can bend, then disappearance no longer requires destruction. A civilization need not fall to be lost. It can simply slip between versions of history, invisible not in space, but in perception. When timelines are bent, civilizations vanish not in space, but in perception. Across continents and centuries, separated by oceans and language, humanity has told itself the same story in different tongues, a story of a great world that fell, a golden age drowned beneath its own brilliance. In the highlands of Peru, elders speak of times, Viracocha times, and the shining ones who came before. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets describe kings who reigned for thousands of years before the Great Flood. The Norse called it times Ragnarok, asterisk the Hindus times Kali Yuga, asterisk the Greeks times the Age of Kronos, asterisk different names, same memory, a cycle of light followed by shadow, of knowledge rising, then collapsing into silence. Maybe these are not myths at all, but the echoes of the real past a single memory fractured through time. When you listen to these stories not as fantasy but as faint record, they begin to align. Floods, fires, and sudden darkness repeat across every tradition. The earth renews itself, civilizations vanish, survivors rebuild. Even science, in its own restrained vocabulary, admits there have been abrupt resets, impacts, eruptions, climate shifts that erased whole cultures. The last ice age ended in chaos. Coastlines redrew themselves, species vanished, and yet humanity endured. Archaeology calls these transitional periods. Myth calls them remembrance. Somewhere between those two lies the truth of what we have forgotten. In the silence after each collapse, something remains, a seed of knowledge, carried through myth into the next dawn. The builders of Göbekli Tepe, rising from the ruins of a flooded world, carved the heavens into stone. The Egyptians spoke of ancestors who came from the island of flame, bringing geometry and order. The Sumerians claimed their writing descended from beings who measured the stars. The pattern repeats. After disaster, teachers appear, and civilization blooms suddenly, as if remembering rather than learning. Maybe Tartaria didn't vanish. Maybe it was the world before this one. The more we look, the more these cycles resemble breathing expansion, contraction, a rhythm too grand for a single lifetime. In every age, humanity reaches a height, touches the edge of something infinite, then falls into amnesia. What we call progress may only be recollection, a slow reconstruction of what once was known. The legends of lost cities Atlantis, Shambhala, Hyperborea may be poetic names for phases of the same civilization, glimpses of an older order whose fragments lie scattered beneath modern nations. Even the languages seem to remember. Words like Tartaros in Greek myth describe a vast realm beneath the earth, not hell, but the underworld, the foundation of the world that came before. In medieval maps, Tartaria occupied that same mysterious northern space, vast and undefined, as though carrying forward an echo of the forgotten homeland. Could the term have been less a political name, and more a residue, the last linguistic shadow of a global culture erased by time? Geological records show that the Earth's magnetic poles have shifted many times, each change accompanied by environmental upheaval. Ancient calendars, Mayan, Vedic, Egyptian, all describe cosmic cycles measured in tens of thousands of years. To them, history was not linear, it was tidal. Civilizations rose with the energy of one era, fell as that energy waned, and rose again when the cycle turned. Within this perspective, Tartaria becomes not an empire lost to maps, but a crest of an older wave, a manifestation of human civilization during its previous ascent. If this is true, then the ruins scattered across our world are not disconnected miracles, but shared memory. The precision of ancient engineering, the repetition of sacred geometries, the universal myths of sky gods and deluges, all could be remnants of a time when humanity understood the rhythm of its own rise and fall. Our ancestors may have built in stone because they knew what was coming, that the next collapse would sweep away the fragile, leaving only what could endure the ages. Modern science stands uneasily beside these patterns. It sees the physical evidence of global catastrophe, ice cores, sediment layers, mass extinctions, but hesitates to connect them to human history. Yet the mythic record insists on continuity. It speaks of survivors, the wise ones, the builders, the wanderers, who carried fragments of lost wisdom into the newborn world. They appear in every legend, bearing fire, knowledge, and tools. Perhaps they were the inheritors of that vanished order we now call Tartaria. There is humility in this possibility. It suggests that we are not the first to harness power, to build cities, to believe we stand at the pinnacle of achievement. Others came before, and they too believed their progress would last forever. But when the world shifted, whether by nature or by hubris, their knowledge scattered into myth, and in the ashes of that memory, new civilizations were born, repeating the cycle with new names and new arrogance. What if history's greatest mystery is not what happened, but what keeps happening? What if every technological leap, every renaissance, is a reawakening, a faint recollection of something our species once knew instinctively? The resonance found in ancient architecture, the shared symbols carved into temples continents apart, the obsession with stars, all may point to a collective subconscious remembering itself. Each generation believes it is discovering. Perhaps it is only remembering. The echoes of the real past grow louder as our tools improve. Satellites reveal submerged cities on continental shelves. AI reconstruction brings clarity to myths once dismissed as allegory. Patterns emerge that defy coincidence. Pyramid alignments matching constellations lost to precession, global trade routes predating recorded seafaring, languages sharing roots no migration can explain. The evidence doesn't shout, it hums, softly, insistently, beneath the surface of our established story. Maybe Tartaria was not an empire erased, but a name given to that hum, the unbroken vibration of a civilization that understood the unity of science, art, and spirit. A civilization that knew the world as living energy, not inert matter. When that knowledge faded, the fragments dispersed, re-emerging in different places as temples, towers, and myths of divine architects. We live among their remnants, calling them wonders, not realizing they are reminders. To consider this is not to abandon reason, but to expand it to admit that memory, like the earth itself, may be cyclical. The golden ages of myth may be geological seasons, recurring long after their names are lost. Each new civilization inherits not only the soil of the old, but its buried memory, whispering through DNA, through dream, through the magnetism of the very stones beneath our feet. As the narrator's voice softens, the question becomes less about proof and more about recognition. What if the myths are not metaphors, but memories, the distant recollections of a species old enough to forget itself? What if every flood, every reset, is the Earth's way of turning the page, and every rediscovery, humanity's way of reading the same story again? If so, then Tartaria is not a mystery to solve, but a mirror to hold. It reflects not a lost kingdom, but the recurring image of human potential. Brilliant, fragile, eternal. And as its echo fades into the quiet, one truth lingers. When timelines fold and civilizations vanish, memory does not die. It waits in ruins, in myth, in the spaces between epochs for those who will listen. For in every ending lies the seed of the next dawn, and from that seed, the keepers of forgotten light will rise once more. There are libraries that have no walls, monasteries with no visible altars, and schools that leave behind no diplomas, only transformation. Their entrances are hidden not by geography, but by understanding. To the casual observer, they are myths, whispers woven into the margins of history. Yet their traces endure in symbols carved discreetly above doorways, in chants that echo from mountain cloisters, in the strange coincidences of thought that reappear centuries apart. What if the real libraries were never built of stone? When the great empires fell, when archives burned and cities drowned, fragments of their knowledge survived, not in vaults, but in memory. Certain minds, aware that civilization itself was fragile, began to guard ideas as monks once guarded relics. Across continents, traditions arose that shared a singular purpose: to preserve what could not safely be written. Some took religious form: the monastic brotherhoods of the East, the mystical orders of Islam, the hidden lineages of early Christianity. Others wore the garb of philosophy or art, transmitting truths in allegory, geometry, or ritual. Outwardly they differed, inwardly they whispered the same language. In the Himalayan monasteries, chants describe a cosmic rhythm, the same harmonic ratios that ancient builders encoded in their temples. In the Western mystery schools, initiates studied architecture and mathematics alongside theology, believing that structure itself was a form of prayer. The Egyptian concept of Ma'at, the balance of opposites, reappears in medieval alchemy, and later in Renaissance architecture as proportion divine. The lineage is invisible but persistent, threading through time like a current beneath the surface. These hidden schools did not seek power. They sought continuity. Their members understood that knowledge untethered from wisdom becomes weaponry. So they wrapped scientific principles in spiritual cloth, disguising fact as metaphor. The geometry that once guided energy through stone cathedrals was taught as sacred art. The resonance that once amplified sound and light was encoded in music theory and ritual. What could no longer be practiced openly was preserved symbolically. The map was hidden inside the myth. Records of these traditions appear like constellations in the dark, scattered but connected. The Rosicrucians in Europe spoke of a brotherhood of light, preserving ancient science in secret. Sufi mystics hinted at an inner geometry of creation known to few. In Tibet, the Bon and Buddhist lineages kept oral teachings describing cyclical worlds and forgotten ages of technology. Even in the West, secret colleges quietly flourished under the guise of guilds and fraternities. Their emblems, compasses, keys, suns, eyes, spoke of an inheritance not entirely human, not entirely divine. To modern historians, these connections seem fanciful, products of imagination, Yet their consistency across time invites deeper attention. Could it be that these societies were less inventors of myth and more custodians of memory? That what they called illumination was not metaphorical enlightenment, but the literal survival of knowledge from a world that once understood light itself, its vibration, its geometry, its power to shape matter. Consider how sudden renaissances appear in history, the inexplicable leaps from darkness to brilliance. Out of the medieval shadows, cathedrals rose with mathematical precision. Out of superstition, the Renaissance bloomed, rediscovering geometry, astronomy, and human potential. These bursts of genius appear less as inventions than as remembering, as if a door opened briefly, releasing the fragrance of a garden long thought dead. Behind those doors may have stood the inheritors of Tartarian science, not as empire builders, but as quiet guardians, ensuring that humanity would one day be ready to rediscover what it had forgotten. The methods of these hidden schools were subtle, designed to outlast persecution. They taught through allegory. The alchemist's furnace symbolized transformation of the self, but also the physics of transmutation. The temple represented the cosmos, but also the resonant structure of matter. Symbols served as both spiritual tools and mnemonic devices, compact containers of complex knowledge that could survive censorship because they appeared harmless. To read them required not faith, but fluency in the language of paradox. Those initiated into such schools were not chosen for lineage, but for temperament. They were poets, mathematicians, architects, healers, people capable of seeing patterns where others saw chaos. Their duty was not to rule, but to remember. They preserved through practice. Meditation as cognitive tuning, chant as frequency manipulation, geometry as vibration. Every ritual encoded a principle of the universe, passed quietly from hand to hand, generation after generation. Some of these orders still exist, though changed beyond recognition. Their symbols have been diluted by time, their teachings fragmented, yet traces remain. The Mason's square, the Hermetic axiom, as above, so below. The Buddhist mandala, each one a fossil of the same philosophy. That reality is patterned, that matter and spirit mirror one another, that creation itself can be understood through proportion and resonance. When seen together, these fragments form a mosaic of endurance. They hint that what we call mysticism may be the memory of an older science, a science too dangerous or too sacred to survive in open form. The line between laboratory and temple, between experiment and prayer, once blurred until both were aspects of the same pursuit. The ancients did not divide the world into physical and spiritual. They studied the energy that unified them. What if the real libraries were never built of stone? The question lingers in the hush of ancient cloisters, in the scent of incense rising through vaulted halls. Knowledge may have survived not in archives, but in consciousness itself, carried through meditation, encoded in music, stored in the ritual structures of faith. Each generation guarded a spark, enough to reignite the flame when the age turned. And perhaps, in the rediscovery of old harmonics, the study of sacred geometry, or the quiet fascination with resonance technology, that spark is stirring once more. If this is true, then the hidden schools were not conspiracies, but lifeboats. They ferried fragments of a drowned civilization into the next era, preserving them until the tides of time receded. Their secrecy was not elitism. It was compassion protection from an age unready to wield such knowledge responsibly. As the narrator's voice softens, we sense that this continuity, fragile, imperfect, but unbroken, may explain the sudden blooms of wisdom that punctuate our history. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the modern scientific revolution, each may have been a ripple from the same submerged source. Somewhere in the world, behind a locked door or in the mind of a humble monk, a few still keep the rhythm. They know that truth cannot be erased, only hidden, and that when humanity listens closely enough, the old language of creation will return. And perhaps that moment is near. For when the hidden becomes visible, when forgotten harmonies awaken in the modern mind, history will remember that its brightest chapters were not accidents of genius, but acts of memory. Soon we will follow those ripples to their visible bloom, to the sparks that rekindled in the world's darkest times, igniting the next rebirth of knowledge. There are centuries in our story that history calls dark times, when art faltered, libraries crumbled, and the great languages of learning fell silent. Yet even in those shadows, light never truly vanished. It smouldered quietly in the hearts of a few, waiting for air. For in every dark age, a few remembered and rebuilt. The fall of Rome scattered knowledge like embers across the wind. Yet in remote monasteries of Ireland, Syria, and the Himalayas, the patient work of transcription continued. By candlelight, monks copied diagrams of stars they could no longer name, blueprints of machines they did not fully understand. They did not create, they preserved. Centuries later, those same drawings would reappear in the workshops of Renaissance inventors, nearly unchanged. What we call innovation may have been recollection. The Gothic cathedrals that rose across Europe stand as the most haunting evidence of this remembering. Emerging suddenly from centuries of architectural simplicity, they seem to defy both gravity and logic. Builders who had never studied advanced geometry constructed structures that resonated with mathematical precision. The vaults of Chartres, the spires of Cologne, the rose windows of Notre Dame, each pulsed with sacred ratios that mirrored the frequencies found in sound and light. These cathedrals were not random triumphs of devotion, they were instruments. Their arches channeled vibration, their domes amplified voice and music until the very air seemed to sing. Scholars attribute this to ingenuity, to the slow evolution of craft. But the precision suggests something else, a revival, not an invention. The knowledge had slept through centuries of chaos, carried by the hidden schools, disguised as divine inspiration. When the age grew quiet enough to listen again, the old language of resonance returned, not from books, but from memory. Perspective in art tells a similar story. For 1,000 years, painters rendered the world as flat and symbolic. Then, as if struck by lightning, the Renaissance rediscovered depth. Within a single generation, geometry re-entered the human eye. Artists like Brunelleschi and Alberti declared that space itself obeyed proportion, that light followed rules as ancient as the stars. But buried in medieval manuscripts were diagrams of this very method, long before the Renaissance claimed it as discovery. It was as if the visual logic of the world had only been forgotten, not unknown. These reappearances follow a pattern too consistent to ignore. The medieval world, supposedly ignorant, produced clocks more accurate than their age should allow, cathedrals aligned to solar events, and alloys of steel whose recipes were lost again for centuries. Knowledge rises, falls, and rises again, guided by unseen continuity. The keepers of those secrets may never have worn crowns or commanded armies. Their victories were quieter, a formula remembered, a method whispered, a measurement passed from hand to hand beneath the notice of kings. In Baghdad's House of Wisdom, scholars translated the remnants of vanished civilizations, Greek, Persian, Indian, Egyptian, into Arabic. They preserved geometry, medicine, and astronomy when Europe slept. Later, that knowledge returned westward under new names, igniting the flame of rediscovery once more. It was as though civilization, fragmented and dispersed, was teaching itself to breathe again. Each monastery, each observatory, each guild was a lung-inhaling memory. And always, just before each rebirth, there was fire. The fall of Constantinople, the sack of libraries, the suppression of heresies, moments when knowledge seemed lost forever. Yet somehow, from the ashes, the same concepts re-emerged with new language and new faces. The knowledge of magnetism, of optics, of proportion, all rediscovered within decades, after being declared impossible or forgotten. Like seeds lying dormant through winter, ideas wait for the right season. The story of the cathedral builders captures this most vividly. Few left written records. Their secrets lived in geometry, encoded in the layout of stone and stained glass. The masons' marks carved into pillars across Europe form a hidden script, repeating symbols whose meaning modern archaeologists still debate. Some suggest they were mere signatures of trade guilds. Others sense something deeper, an encoded tradition stretching across generations, ensuring that knowledge would survive even when words could not. Science, art, and spirituality all seem to converge in these bursts of remembering. The same ratios that governed music guided architecture. The same geometry that described the heavens appeared in the floor plans of temples. This unity hints at an older worldview, one in which all disciplines shared a single origin. The Middle Ages, for all their superstition, may have carried the last living pulse of that synthesis, preserving it under the guise of faith. The pattern continues into later centuries. The sudden emergence of the printing press, almost simultaneous in multiple regions. The mysterious knowledge of metallurgy that allowed Damascus steel to be forged with nanostructures modern laboratories still struggle to replicate. The appearance of accurate world maps before the official age of exploration. Each event feels less like a leap forward and more like an echo rising through time, faint, then clear, as memory reasserts itself. Perhaps the Dark Ages were not as dark as we imagine. Perhaps they were the breathing pause between cycles, a night through which knowledge moved unseen, carried by those who refused to let the flame die. Monks, masons, scholars, mystics, each tended their small ember. None could see the whole fire, but together they kept the possibility of dawn alive. What survives of that era reminds us that progress is never linear. It flickers, it falters, it hides, yet it endures. The cathedrals still stand, their stones humming faintly with the same ratios that shaped the pyramids and ziggurats. The illuminated manuscripts still glow with geometry disguised as art. Even in our age of glass and circuitry, their presence feels familiar, like an old melody half remembered. It is the rhythm of human continuity, of remembering just enough to rebuild what was lost. In every dark age, a few remembered and rebuilt. They became the bridge between worlds, their craft a silent defiance against oblivion. Theirs was not the pursuit of fame, but of fidelity, a promise to the past that it would not be extinguished. Through their work, the forgotten endured, waiting for the next awakening. And now, as we stand in another age of noise and brilliance, the pattern seems to return. Knowledge accelerates, yet understanding lags. The old harmonies call again from the walls of ancient temples and the frequencies of the earth itself. The same hum that moved through the cathedrals still vibrates in our machines, in our circuits, in our curiosity. If the flame survived, where does it burn now? There was a time when forgetting required fire, when empires erased their enemies by burning books and shattering statues. Now, the flames are colder, quieter, and infinitely more efficient. We no longer need to destroy the written word. We simply drown it in noise, bury it in endless versions of truth, until the original becomes indistinguishable from its reflections. What if we're living through our own great erasure? The modern age, for all its brilliance, has perfected the art of controlled memory. Our libraries are digital, our archives intangible, our history stored not in stone but in fragile sequences of code. It feels eternal, the cloud, the server, the infinite network, yet it is as mortal as the systems that feed it. One power outage, one policy change, one flicker of deletion, and centuries of human thought could vanish without smoke or witnesses. We live in an empire built not on knowledge, but on its simulation. The parallels to the past are uncanny. Where ancient kings controlled scribes, modern corporations control algorithms. Where priests once decided which scriptures were sacred, data curators now decide which information is visible. Our modern gatekeepers are not cloaked in robes or crowns, they wear the invisible authority of code. Their decisions shape the collective memory of humanity, determining what rises in search results and what is quietly pushed beneath the surface, where it will never be found again. We tell ourselves we have access to everything. Yet the more we search, the smaller our world becomes. The algorithms, designed to please, to personalize, to simplify, narrow the range of what we see until it mirrors what we already believe. This is the new censorship, not prohibition, but precision. The truth is not hidden, it is outnumbered. In the ancient world, suppression required destruction. Today, it requires abundance. Even the tools of preservation have become instruments of forgetting. Digital archives degrade faster than parchment. Files corrupt. Formats change. Links rot silently, leaving only error messages where once there was knowledge. The average lifespan of a web page is less than 5 years. Historians of the future may one day study us and find gaps wider than any caused by ancient fires, entire eras of data lost to obsolescence. The Library of Alexandria burned once. Our libraries die 1,000 small deaths every day, unseen, unremarked. The illusion of permanence is seductive. We trust that because our devices remember for us, we no longer need to. But memory outsourced is memory at risk. What happens when the companies that hold our history decide to rewrite their terms of service, or governments decide to protect us from misinformation? The erasure is subtle, bureaucratic, justified. It doesn't look like censorship, it looks like safety. We've seen the pattern before. Every empire begins by collecting knowledge and ends by controlling it. The Roman archives, the Vatican's vaults, the Soviet records, each sought to curate the truth. The digital age is no different, only faster. Our modern empire spans the globe, its citizens connected by invisible threads of data. But these threads are not free. They are woven by those who profit from what we remember. The new conquerors do not seize land, they seize narrative. Perhaps the most fragile illusion of all is that information equals wisdom. We are surrounded by data, yet starved for understanding. The constant stream numbs the mind, fragmenting attention until patterns dissolve. In such noise, deeper truths cannot survive. They require stillness, reflection, silence, the very qualities our world now treats as inefficiency. The machinery of forgetting hums not through censorship alone, but through distraction. History repeats in different costumes. Where scribes once replaced forbidden passages, editors now update them. Where monuments once fell to invaders, digital monuments fall to rebranding and redesign. The same mechanism control through narrative adapts seamlessly to every new technology. And we, believing ourselves enlightened, participate willingly. We click agree. We scroll endlessly. We let the machine decide what deserves our eyes. In doing so, we curate our own amnesia. There is something haunting about the speed at which the present devours itself. News becomes obsolete in hours. Archives are replaced before they mature. The collective attention span has shortened to match the rhythm of updates. And yet, beneath this acceleration, an old pattern breathes the same impulse that drove kings to silence prophets and priests to suppress heresy: fear of uncertainty. Power cannot survive mystery. The unknown invites questions, and questions destabilize control. So we are offered answers instead, instant, absolute, comforting. But truth, like memory, does not thrive under comfort. It survives in resistance in the effort to look again, to notice what was omitted. Those who question the official timeline of the present are branded with the same words once reserved for heretics: dangerous, delusional, unverified. And yet, as history shows, every age has needed its skeptics to prevent complete darkness. Our world may not burn its archives, but it buries them beneath convenience. The endless feed of entertainment, the constant refresh of news, the flood of opinion masquerading as fact, all serve the same ancient purpose: to distract the mind from what matters. We are not being made ignorant, we are being kept busy. And in that busyness, the thread of continuity, the fragile awareness of who we are and where we came from, begins to fray once more. Still, even in this empire of forgetting, resistance stirs. Digital preservationists mirror the monks of old, archiving endangered data. Independent thinkers rebuild lost websites like modern cathedrals, stone by digital stone. The open source movement becomes a rebellion against intellectual monopoly, an echo of the ancient scholars who hid forbidden books in hollow walls. Each saved file, each backed up archive, is an act of faith in memory itself. What we face now is not merely the loss of information, but the erosion of context, the slow disconnection of meaning from data. Without context, knowledge fragments into trivia. Without continuity, wisdom fades. The most dangerous erasure is not the deletion of facts, but the distortion of their relationships. And this distortion grows each time history is rewritten to serve the moment. The narrator's voice lowers, calm yet insistent, as though speaking to a civilization on the edge of déjà vu. We have seen this before. It says, the narrowing of vision, the worship of progress, the confidence that forgetting can never touch us. Yet, forgetting always returns, dressed in the tools of its own age. The question that remains is not whether we will be erased, but whether we will notice it happening. Can we still remember what true memory feels like: slow, imperfect, alive? Or have we surrendered it entirely to machines that remember only what they are told? If we're repeating the cycle, can we break it? There is a quiet stirring moving through the world, not a revolution in the streets, but in the mind. Across continents and languages, people are beginning to search, to question, to remember. They open old archives once left unread, scroll through digitized maps that contradict the ones they learnt in school, and compare stories told by their grandparents to those written in the books. It is subtle, almost invisible, yet unmistakable, a global pulse of curiosity awakening beneath the hum of daily life. Perhaps remembering is humanity's oldest rebellion. For generations, we have been taught to trust the map more than the terrain, the textbook more than the ruins under our feet. But something in the human spirit resists confinement. We sense when the story does not fit, when the silence between facts feels too heavy. That restlessness has returned. Late at night, in the glow of computer screens, millions of minds reach backward through time, searching for the pieces that were lost. A teacher in Brazil finds an 18th century atlas that shows another name where Siberia now lies. A student in Japan notices ancient architecture echoing patterns half a world away. A historian in Canada unearths letters describing a vanished culture dismissed as legend. These are not coincidences. They are fragments of an older memory, converging through the invisible web that now binds us together. For the first time in centuries, history no longer belongs only to the institutions. The collective archive has escaped its keepers. Each upload, each translation, each rediscovered image becomes a thread in a tapestry of global remembering. Strangers collaborate across borders, piecing together what the past tried to scatter. The internet, for all its chaos, has become the nervous system of memory itself, unpredictable, alive, unstoppable. There is beauty in this awakening. It is not driven by ideology, but by longing and need to feel connected to something older and larger than the present moment. People who once scrolled in boredom now scroll in wonder, falling down labyrinths of forgotten knowledge. Lost cities, strange inventions, misdated maps. They do not seek certainty. They seek belonging, the sense that humanity's story is vaster than the narrow corridor we've been shown. In rediscovering the forgotten, they rediscover themselves. It begins with small questions. Who built this? Why does this symbol appear everywhere? Why do the same stories echo from Egypt to Peru to Siberia? Questions that once earned silence now find community. Across forums, podcasts, and midnight discussions, a new language of curiosity forms, not academic, not dogmatic, but human. Every question becomes an act of defiance against amnesia. Every new discovery, a reminder that knowledge is not a commodity, but a birthright. The tone of the era is changing. Where once skepticism meant dismissal, it now means attention. Where once doubt fractured belief, it now unites seekers across disciplines. Scientists and mystics, artists and engineers all begin to sense the same pattern, that the world is older, stranger, and more connected than we've been told. It is not conspiracy, it is continuity. The forgotten is calling back, and the world is beginning to answer. In this awakening, technology plays paradox and profit. The same systems that once narrowed perception are now tearing open new horizons. Algorithms meant to entertain end up revealing anomalies, old maps, obscure manuscripts, fragments of suppressed data. Artificial intelligence, trained to classify, begins to notice patterns no one programmed it to find: linguistic symmetries, architectural ratios, resonances that hint at a shared origin beneath recorded time. It is as though our own machines are beginning to remember alongside us. And yet the awakening is not only digital, it is emotional, spiritual. People are learning to feel the weight of forgotten truth. When they stand before ancient monuments, they no longer see mere stone. They feel the pulse of something intelligent that once moved through humanity, a memory older than nations, older than names. The cathedrals, the pyramids, the stepwells, and stelae, they no longer feel distant. They feel familiar, as though built by hands that still live in our bones. For centuries, forgetting was power. To control memory was to control meaning. But the collective act of remembering dissolves control. It cannot be taxed, censored, or contained. A single fragment shared can awaken thousands. A single question, once whispered, can echo across the world. That is the quiet revolution unfolding now, not of ideology, but of awareness. This reawakening does not promise answers, it promises perspective. It asks us to see history not as a sequence, but as a pulse expanding, contracting, returning. To see humanity not as a species moving forward, but as a consciousness remembering itself through cycles of light and shadow. Each rediscovery is not progress, but reunion. The narrator's voice softens, contemplative, almost tender. Perhaps, it suggests, this is what our ancestors meant by prophecy, not visions of the future, but memories of what must come again. Every golden age was once a memory reborn. Every renaissance began as remembering. The same may be true now. We live in an age of unprecedented connection, but perhaps connection was always the point, the mechanism through which the fragments of our past find one another again. Still, remembering is not without consequence. To remember is to question, and to question is to disrupt. Institutions built on curated stories tremble when the collective begins to recall the unedited past. But memory cannot be unlearned once it awakens. It changes how we see everything, not just history, but ourselves. The myths of lost civilizations no longer feel distant. They feel prophetic. The cycles of rise and fall begin to seem less like tragedy and more like rhythm. And within that rhythm, there is hope. Because remembering is not simply looking backward, it is also reclaiming the future. A society that remembers deeply cannot be ruled by fear. A people who know they have risen before will rise again. The act of remembering restores dignity to the human journey, reminding us that even in our darkest ages, we never truly forget. We only wait for the right generation to remember. And so, this global awakening becomes more than curiosity, it becomes healing. It reconnects what was divided, reason and wonder, science and myth, the individual and the collective. For perhaps the true purpose of rediscovery is not to prove the past, but to awaken the present. When we remember what we were, we remember what we are capable of being again. As the music fades, the narrator lingers on a final reflection, soft as a breath. Maybe memory itself is alive, a vast consciousness moving through humanity, choosing when to sleep and when to stir. And maybe, right now, it is opening its eyes. If we're repeating the cycle, can we break it? Or perhaps breaking it is not the point. Perhaps the point is to remember well enough that next time we no longer forget. Truth has always felt like something solid, a mountain we can climb, a horizon we can measure. Yet when we reach its summit, the ground shifts beneath us. What we call truth changes with the light, with the teller, with the need of the moment. The more we chase it, the more it dissolves into memory. Maybe the real mystery isn't what was lost, but why we forget. Humanity has built its identity on stories. Nations, religions, families, all are woven from narrative threads that tell us who we are. But stories, even the truest ones, are shaped by perspective. We forget that memory is not a recording, it is a reconstruction. Each time we recall, we rebuild. What we remember changes with who we are. The past, therefore, is not fixed, it is continuously edited by the present. Psychologists call this the times reconstructive nature of memory. Asterisk. When you recall an event, your brain does not replay it like film. It reassembles fragments stored in different places, filling gaps with inference and imagination. Collective memory functions the same way. Societies remember through retelling, through ritual and record. Over time, each generation adjusts the narrative to fit its understanding. We inherit not the event, but the version that survived. Truth becomes the residue of what a culture can bear to remember. If this is so, then perhaps history is not what happened, but what we agree to believe happened. The borders between fact and story blur, and we are left not with certainty, but with layers, strata of perception compressed by time. The topsoil of our history books rests upon a bedrock of unverified memory, and beneath that, the deep sediment of myth. And somewhere below it all, perhaps, lies what really occurred, too heavy for language, too vast for narrative, too fragile to survive intact. Even science, our most rigorous pursuit of truth, is not immune to this paradox. Every equation, every model, every theory is a story we tell about how the world behaves. When a better story arises, we replace the old one, often forgetting that the old was once considered truth. We build monuments to certainty, then quietly revise their foundations. The scientific method itself acknowledges this. Truth, in its eyes, is provisional. Knowledge evolves because we are always remembering differently. This realization does not diminish our achievements, it humanizes them. To seek truth is to engage in an endless dialogue between memory and discovery. We are not liars by nature, we are interpreters. Our errors are not failures, but evidence that consciousness itself is alive, flexible, fallible, creative. Each age constructs a mirror to understand itself, and calls the reflection truth. But no mirror ever shows the whole room. In the grand arc of civilization, truth has been rewritten as often as it has been revealed. When an empire rises, it tells one version of events. When it falls, another replaces it. The victors write the record, the survivors tell the tale, and the defeated vanish into myth. What we call objectivity is often the perspective of power, and yet, within every biased chronicle, a glimmer of reality remains the echo of something that truly happened, distorted, but not destroyed. Our challenge is not to find the pure truth, but to recognize how our remembering shapes it. Maybe forgetting is not a flaw, but a function. Memory, both personal and collective, is selective for a reason. It filters the unbearable, smooths the chaos, allows continuity. Without forgetting, we would drown in the noise of everything that ever was. To forget is to create narrative. To remember is to feel meaning. The tragedy, then, is not that we forget, but that we forget we are forgetting. If truth depends on memory, and memory depends on storytelling, then every civilization lives within its own mythology, a mythology it calls history. This does not make history false, it makes it human. We cannot escape the lens through which we see. We can only become aware of it. Awareness, perhaps, is the closest we can come to objectivity, the humility to know that our truth is one reflection among many. Imagine the vast timeline of humanity as a stained glass window. Each generation adds its own fragment, its own color, its own design. From within, the light seems clear. From outside, it is fractured, overlapping, incomplete. Both views are real, both are partial. The mystery of truth lies not in choosing one, but in realizing they are the same window. When civilizations collapse, it is not just knowledge that disappears, it is context. Without context, even the clearest truth becomes opaque. A symbol, a map, a piece of technology may survive, but its meaning is lost, awaiting reinterpretation. Centuries later, we rediscover it and project our own understanding upon it. In this way, every age reconstructs the past in its own image, believing it has found revelation when it has only found reflection. Still, something persists beyond revision. Call it resonance, or continuity, an undercurrent of understanding that transcends narrative. It manifests in the recurring patterns of architecture, the shared myth of the flood, the eternal return of the same archetypes. This is the closest thing to timeless truth we possess. Not a fact, but a frequency. The details change. The melody remains. To seek truth without memory is to chase light without shadow. We need forgetting as much as we need remembrance. Together, they form the rhythm of meaning. Perhaps that is why history alternates between revelation and loss, because the human mind, like the world itself, breathes. Expansion, contraction, knowing, unknowing. The pulse of consciousness, measured not in years, but in awareness. And so the documentary's focus shifts from what was lost to what it means to lose. Truth, it suggests, may never be a destination, but an ongoing act of balancing between certainty and doubt. What we call knowledge is only a moment of clarity in the fog of time. To know this is not despair, but freedom. If truth is always in motion, then remembering is not about restoring the past. It is about staying awake to the present. The narrator's voice lowers, almost to a whisper. Maybe the real mystery isn't what was lost, it repeats, but why we forget. Because in that forgetting lies the key to understanding ourselves, the fragile, luminous creatures who build stories against the dark. As the music fades, the reflection deepens. If memory shapes truth, and truth shapes civilization, then what happens when we remember differently? What new world might emerge when the act of remembering itself becomes conscious? The answer waits, quietly, in the final chamber where the weight of the forgotten will finally meet the light. To lose a civilization is to lose a version of ourselves. Not only the monuments and inventions, but the very texture of thought, the dreams they dreamed, the questions they asked, the sound of their laughter carried by wind through vanished streets. When we erase the past, we do not simply forget their achievements. We forget what it felt like to be human in their time. What dies is not knowledge, but empathy. Every civilization is a conversation between the living and the dead. The builders who shaped cathedrals, the astronomers who charted invisible skies, the poets who mapped the soul, all speak across centuries through their creations. But when their voices are silenced, when their works are misattributed, burned, or dismissed, the conversation ends. The silence that follows is not peaceful, it is hollow, like a note held too long after the music has gone. Humanity feels smaller in that silence, as if missing a limb it can no longer name. Walk through any museum and you can sense it, that faint ache between the exhibits, the spaces where things should be. Behind the glass, the artifacts stare back at us with mute accusation. Their beauty is intact, but their story is gone. A sculpture becomes an ornament, a manuscript a curiosity. Without context, meaning withers. We admire what we no longer understand. And somewhere, the artisans who shaped these relics, those who labored, imagined, perfected drift, unanchored through time, unremembered. History tends to celebrate conquerors and kings, but the true weight of forgetting rests on the invisible ones. The masons who carved symbols that outlasted their names. The women who wove celestial maps into tapestries. The astronomers whose records were buried with their bones. Each lost archive is not just a missing book, but a missing heartbeat. Every erased name is a question we can no longer ask. The grandeur of the past is built upon countless quiet sacrifices, and when we let those vanish, we lose the mirror that teaches us humility. Imagine what it must have felt like to live in those lost ages, to build something meant to last forever, believing your work would speak to the unborn, only for it to dissolve into rumor. A cathedral builder chiseling patterns of sacred geometry that no modern scholar can decode. A philosopher recording natural laws centuries before science would rediscover them. A healer preserving knowledge of sound and frequency long before physics gave them words. Each must have believed that the future would remember. How cruel, then, that the future has forgotten. Forgetting does not destroy the past, but it exiles it. The evidence remains, scattered like ashes, yet stripped of meaning. We pass the ruins and marvel at their endurance, without realizing they endure for us silent testimonies to what was once known. Each stone whispers, asterisk, I was part of a greater design, asterisk. But we no longer know the language. To lose a civilization is to lose part of our collective imagination. The forgotten world becomes a shadow realm we can only glimpse in dreams and myths. And yet, within that shadow, emotion lingers, awe, sorrow, yearning. We feel it when we stand before ruins at dusk, when the light fades and the outlines blur. The heart recognizes what the mind has forgotten. It's a grief too deep for words, an ancestral memory stirring somewhere beneath language. Maybe this is why we keep building skyscrapers, monuments, data networks, as if trying to resurrect that connection. Each new age constructs its own versions of permanence, trying to compensate for the fragility of memory. But no monument, however vast, can protect against the erosion of meaning. The only true preservation lies in remembrance, not in marble, but in awareness. The emotional gravity of forgetting is immense because it is cumulative. We inherit it without knowing. Every lost story adds weight to our own disorientation, making the present feel thinner, more fragile. We feel it in our restlessness, in the vague sense that something essential has been misplaced. Perhaps the modern world's anxiety is not about progress, but about absence, the quiet intuition that somewhere, long ago, we lost the thread that connected us to the whole. When a civilization disappears, it takes its philosophy of being with it, its understanding of harmony, ethics, purpose. The wisdom that balanced technology with spirit vanishes. and the survivors rebuild in fragments, rediscovering pieces, but never the pattern. Tartaria, if it existed, may have been such a pattern, not a single empire, but an idea of unity between knowledge and reverence. Its loss is felt not in the ruins of stone, but in the division that followed: science without soul, power without wisdom, memory without meaning. And yet, even in forgetting, something endures. The emotional resonance of the lost past becomes a kind of gravity, drawing seekers toward it across generations. It pulls us to old maps, ancient texts, mysterious symbols, not because we want to escape the present, but because we sense that within those echoes lies something familiar. We are haunted not by mystery, but by recognition. Perhaps that is why the stories of vanished civilizations never die. Atlantis, Lemuria, Tartaria, their names change, but the ache remains the same. They represent what we sense but cannot recall. An age when human understanding and the natural world were not divided. When architecture sang and science was prayer. Their loss is our wound, their memory, our inheritance. The narrator pauses, voice soft as falling dust. To lose a civilization is to lose a version of ourselves. It repeats, but also to lose the part of us that knew how to live in balance. The weight of the forgotten presses gently on the listener, not as despair, but as longing, the ache of unfinished remembrance. The silence between centuries is not emptiness. It is a pause in a symphony waiting to resume. Every forgotten culture leaves an afterglow, faint but persistent. We feel it in the art that still moves us, in the unexplained brilliance of ancient design, in the yearning that drives us to search beyond the visible. The forgotten never truly vanish. They wait at the edge of awareness, patient as dawn. And as this chapter closes, the tone shifts from mourning to anticipation. For if forgetting has such power, remembering must hold greater. The story of what was lost may yet become the story of what returns, because behind every ruin, every mystery, every unanswered question, something still calls to us, steady, luminous, alive. The question now is not how they disappeared, but what they left within us, what ember of their knowing continues to glow beneath the ash of time. That ember, faint though it seems, has never gone out. It burns still, waiting for recognition. And when we finally look toward that quiet light, we may find that the forgotten have been waiting for us not to mourn them, but to finish what they began. The story we followed through maps, ruins, archives, and memory has been a search for something that might never have had walls, kings, or borders. We called it Tartaria, because that was the name left behind a word, half erased, but not silent, an echo that refused to die. Yet, as the dust of centuries settles, a deeper realization emerges. Tartaria may not have disappeared, it may have become us. Every age believes it stands at the end of history. Every empire imagines itself eternal. But time teaches the same lesson again and again, that civilizations are not destroyed, they transform. The knowledge we think of as ours might be the sediment of worlds long gone, compacted into our instincts, our art, our architecture. The past does not vanish. It becomes the foundation beneath the next story. And in that sense, Tartaria was not an empire of land, but of consciousness. The clues we've uncovered, the impossible architecture, the hidden archives, the mysterious continuity of design, all point toward a civilization that understood something we are still learning. That knowledge is not possession, but participation. Their cathedrals sang because they were tuned to the frequencies of life itself. Their geometry mirrored the structure of creation. They built as if the act of building was prayer. When that world ended, its wisdom didn't burn. It diffused. It became myth, symbol, intuition. It became us. Imagine for a moment that humanity is one continuous civilization, forever rising and falling, shedding names like old skins. Each cycle carries fragments of the last, an equation remembered, a tool rediscovered, a story retold. What we call progress may simply be the remembering of something we once knew by heart. The lost world of Tartaria, Atlantis, Shambhala, all may be chapters in the same eternal rhythm. Ascent, forgetting, rediscovery. In this light, the mystery becomes tender rather than tragic. The disappearance of Tartaria is not a loss, but a transition, the metamorphosis of knowledge from form into essence. Empires of stone crumble, but ideas migrate. They take refuge in art, in mathematics, in the quiet architecture of the human spirit. We are not the descendants of that empire. We are its continuation, its next verse. Perhaps this is why their symbols feel so familiar. The domes, the spirals, the mirrored proportions, they resonate, not because they are foreign, but because they are home. Something in us recognizes their logic instinctively. Their ruins speak in a language the heart remembers, even when the mind does not. That recognition is the inheritance of humanity, an unbroken dialogue between the ancient and the modern, between what was built and what was dreamed. When we speak of Tartaria now, we are not speaking of a place. We are speaking of a principle, the idea that knowledge, once born, never dies. It moves through time like light through water, refracted but unextinguished. Every generation bends it differently, but the radiance remains. In one age, it builds temples. In another, it builds machines. In another still, it builds understanding. And each time we rediscover it, we call it by a new name. Look around. The same hunger for harmony that shaped their architecture shapes our technology. The circuits that pulse through our cities mirror the sacred grids that once defined their monuments. The digital web connecting us echoes the old geomagnetic networks traced by their towers. Humanity repeats itself, not out of failure, but out of fidelity, a deep, unconscious promise to complete what was left unfinished. The narrator's tone softens, like the hush after revelation. Perhaps, it suggests, every so-called lost civilization is simply a mirror, reflecting back to us the potential we keep forgetting we have. The story of Tartaria, then, is the story of human continuity, a reminder that the flame of curiosity never truly goes out, that even when the libraries burn and the towers fall, knowledge survives in the only place it ever truly lived, within us. All the anomalies we explored, the advanced architecture, the erased archives, the global echoes become, in this final view, not evidence of conspiracy, but of connection. The deeper pattern is not suppression, but renewal. Every age must forget just enough to learn again, for discovery without wonder is sterile, and knowledge without humility is dangerous. The cycle ensures both. Tartaria, like every civilization before and after, rose not merely to build, but to remind. To lose it, then, was not punishment, but preparation. Its fall carved space for the next awakening, the next remembering. Its stones became the seeds of new thought. Its silence became our question. And that question, the hunger to understand where we come from, what we once were, is the pulse of humanity itself. Perhaps that is the true empire, not one of territory or time, but of mind. An empire of continuity, built from the courage to question and the humility to begin again. Its borders are not drawn on maps, but in awareness. Its currency is curiosity. Its laws are wonder and compassion. To belong to it requires no lineage, only the willingness to remember that knowledge is sacred, because it connects. The camera of the imagination drifts upward now from the ruins of forgotten cities, across continents, over oceans. The old maps fade into a living one, lights of modern cities glowing like constellations, mirroring the stars above. It looks less like a planet than a vast organism remembering itself. Every flicker of curiosity, every rediscovery, every whispered "what if" becomes a spark in this global body, the living continuation of the knowledge that once was. Tartaria, then, is not gone. It has distributed its essence, diffused into the collective consciousness of humankind. Its truths live in our cathedrals and our circuits, in our art and our algorithms, in the geometry of our cities and the structure of our thoughts. It was never a vanished empire, but a vision of what civilization can be when knowledge and wonder walk together. And now, as the voice grows quieter, it offers a final reflection. Perhaps all lost civilizations share the same fate, to dissolve so completely that only their wisdom remains, freed from the burden of identity. Perhaps that is immortality, not to be remembered as a name, but to endure as an influence, a melody that keeps resurfacing in new keys. The film pauses on this thought, the hum of wind over an empty plain, the faint shimmer of auroras where old maps once wrote Tartaria. The past and present merge until they are indistinguishable, because the truth was never in the empire itself, but in what it taught us to seek, that knowledge is eternal, that forgetting is temporary, and that every age, no matter how modern, is a chance to begin the story again. And as the scene fades into the quiet of dawn, the narrator leaves us with one final reminder, soft as breath. Tartaria may not have disappeared. It may have become us. The journey began with dust-covered maps and forgotten names, whispers of an empire too vast, too mysterious, to fit inside our history books. But now, as the story draws to its close, it becomes clear that we were never searching for Tartaria alone. We were searching for the part of ourselves that remembers. Every ruin, every erased name, every contradiction in the record was a mirror held up to the human spirit, asking if we still knew how to see. The silence of the past has never been absolute. Beneath the noise of conquest and progress, a soft pulse has continued, the heartbeat of remembrance. It vibrates through architecture, through art, through the persistent human instinct to build, to question, to dream. It calls to us in patterns too old to name, in harmonies buried beneath centuries of translation. And when we listen closely enough, we hear it whispering through time. Asterisk. In the ruins of erased empires, the light still waits, and this time we are the rememberers. Asterisk. Every generation inherits the same question. What was lost, and why? But perhaps the real mystery was never about recovery. It was about readiness. Truth does not vanish when it is buried. It sleeps, waiting for the right consciousness to awaken it. The ancients seemed to know this. They built in stone not to defy time, but to communicate with it. They trusted that one day, someone would look up at their impossible architecture and remember what it meant. That day may be now. Our tools, satellites, sensors, digital archives have become the new archaeology of awareness. We can see what our ancestors saw and what they could not. We can zoom in on the smallest engraving or view an entire planet at once. We are no longer confined by geography or by gatekeepers. The walls between disciplines, nations, and centuries are thinning. Knowledge, like light, moves freely again. The more we connect, the more the fragments align. And yet, the rediscovery is not only technological, it is spiritual. To remember is not to collect facts, but to recover wonder. The real resurrection of the forgotten begins inside us, when we allow curiosity to replace certainty, when we choose humility over arrogance, and when we remember that every story, no matter how ancient, is still part of our own unfolding. We are the latest caretakers of a flame that has burned through ages of forgetting. The light is older than language, and still it burns. There is a symmetry to this awakening. Just as the ancients once built towers to capture the heavens, we now build networks that capture knowledge. The same yearning drives both, the desire to reach beyond limitation, to touch the infinite. What once took centuries now happens in seconds, discoveries shared, ideas reborn, mysteries reopened. Humanity has become its own library, its own living archive. Each thought, each rediscovery, each whisper of wonder adds to the collective remembering. Perhaps this was always the plan, that knowledge, once suppressed, would scatter like seeds across the world, hidden in architecture, myth, and intuition, waiting for an age capable of hearing them again. And maybe that age is ours. We are the generation standing between eras, inheritors of both memory and machine, learning how to blend the ancient and the digital, the intuitive and the empirical. The light that once flickered in temples and cathedrals now flickers in screens and satellites, but its purpose remains the same, to illuminate. Look around. The world is remembering itself. Ancient languages are being decoded by artificial intelligence. Lost cities are emerging from jungles through the eyes of drones. Manuscripts once thought meaningless are revealing patterns of mathematics and astronomy. The walls that once separated science from myth, the sacred from the rational, are dissolving. Each discovery tells the same story in a new dialect, that knowledge is cyclical, eternal, and far more compassionate than we ever imagined. The narrator's tone softens, almost prayerful. If we can remember together, it says, perhaps we can heal what forgetting has broken. For the tragedy of amnesia is not only loss of fact, but loss of connection. We forgot not only who we were, but that we were one. Every empire that rose and fell did so under the illusion of separation of us and them, of progress and decline, of civilized and primitive. But knowledge has no nationality, no owner, no end. It is the one empire that cannot fall. This realization changes everything. The search for Tartaria becomes a parable not of conspiracy, but of continuity. It reminds us that the great erasures of history cannot outlast the human impulse to seek. Every question asked in sincerity becomes an act of remembrance. Every discovery, an act of forgiveness. We are not condemned to repeat the cycles of forgetting. We are invited to complete them, to carry their lessons forward, without the arrogance that doomed the ages before. Maybe this is what it means to awaken, not to uncover a single hidden truth, but to rediscover our participation in an unbroken story. The same curiosity that led the first astronomers to chart the stars now leads modern minds to explore consciousness itself. The same awe that carved pyramids now drives our telescopes and equations. We are the same species, forever building monuments to our longing. The form changes. The purpose remains. As dawn breaks over the final scene, the light touching mountains, rivers, and cities, the narrator's voice becomes a whisper, neither ending nor beginning, only continuing. The light never left, it says. It was waiting for us to open our eyes. The ruins are not ruins anymore. They are reflections, markers left by our ancestors to remind us that nothing truly vanishes. Knowledge, once buried under politics, fire, or time, rises again in new form. Every rediscovery is a resurrection. Every act of remembrance, a rebellion against entropy. The forgotten light does not belong to the past. It belongs to everyone who dares to look for it. And so, the story ends where it began, with a map. But this time, the map is not drawn on paper or stone. It is drawn in connection between minds, between ages, between what was and what will be. It is the map of memory itself, infinite, alive, expanding with every act of curiosity. The voice fades into silence, leaving a final truth that feels less like an answer and more like an invitation. In the ruins of erased empires, the light still waits, and this time, we are the remembers.